Flora Newsom yanked the wedding ring off her finger and threw it across the barn floor straight at the boots of the man they called the Wolf of the Valley. "You bought me," she said, "so don't you dare pretend this is a marriage." Tucker Blackburn didn't flinch. He bent down slow, picked up the ring from the dirt, and held it out to her on his open palm like it weighed nothing at all. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I paid your father's debt. What you are to me that ain't decided yet. That part's still yours." Before we go on, if this story finds you tonight, do me a kindness. Subscribe to the channel, stay with me all the way to the end, and tell me in the comments what town you're watching from, so I can see just how far Flora and Tucker's story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The first thing Flora Newsom learned about her wedding was that nobody asked her. She learned it in the kitchen of her father's failing ranch 3 days before the drought of 1876 finally broke every promise the Newsom family had ever made to itself. She was elbow-deep in a washtub scrubbing a shirt that had more patch than cloth when her father came through the door with his hat in his hands and his eyes anywhere but on her. "Flora," Harlan Newsom said, "set that down. We need to talk." "I can talk and scrub, Pa." "Set it down." She set it down. She wiped her hands on her apron and waited because she'd learned the sound of bad news the way you learn the sound of a rattlesnake low and dry and coming before you see it. "You know we're behind," he said. "I know. We're worse than behind. The bank's called the note. Whole thing. All of it due by month's end." Flora felt the floor tilt just slightly under her, the way it does when a person hears a thing they suspected but hoped they were wrong about. "How much?" "Don't matter how much." "How much, Pa?" "More than we'll see in 3 good years," he said. "And we ain't had 1 good year since your mother passed." She let that sit. Outside, the wind moved dust against the window in a soft hiss, the same wind that had killed their corn and thinned their cattle and turned the creek to a cracked brown ribbon. "So we sell," she said. "We sell the far pasture, we sell the... Ain't nobody buying dirt, Flora. Not in a drought. Land's worth nothing when there's no water on it." "Then what?" she said. "What are you telling me?" And her father, Harlan Newsom, a man who had once carried her on his shoulders through a spring meadow and told her she was worth more than the whole state of Colorado, could not look his daughter in the eye when he said it. Tucker Blackburn's offered to clear the note. The name landed in the room like a dropped iron. "No," Flora said before she even understood the whole shape of what he meant. "No, Pa. He's offered to clear the whole debt, every cent, and leave us the ranch besides." "In exchange for what?" Her father's jaw worked. His hands turned the hat brim around and around. "For what, Pa?" "For your hand," he said. "He wants to marry you." Flora Newsom had heard the name, Tucker Blackburn, her whole life, the way children hear the name of the thing under the bed. The Wolf of the Valley. The man who owned 20,000 acres and every soul on them. The man, they said, burned a ranch to the ground with the family still inside. The man who had a boy hanged for stealing folks, whispered, though nobody could tell you the boy's name. The man nobody in Copper Creek would cross because the ones who crossed him were not around anymore to warn the rest. "You'd give me to him," she said, and her voice came out strange to her own ears flat far away. "You'd hand your own daughter to that." "Flora, to the wolf. He ain't as bad as... They say he killed people, Pa." Her voice cracked at last, and she hated it. Hated the crack because she'd sworn to herself she would not cry in front of him. "They say he burned folks alive. They say a boy no older than 16 swung from a rope on his order, and you'd send me to sleep under his roof. I don't have a choice." "You always say that." She stepped back from him, back toward the window and the dead brown light. "Every time you do something you're ashamed of, you say you don't have a choice. But there's always a choice, Pa. You just don't like the price of the other one." Harlan Newsom finally looked at her then, and what she saw in his face was not cruelty. It was something worse. It was defeat. "You want the honest truth," he said. If I don't take his offer, we lose the ranch anyway. And then I got nothing to give you. No dowry, no home, no name worth anything. You'd be a debtor's daughter in a town that don't forget debts. You'd be nothing, Flora. At least this way you'd be somebody's wife. His wife. A rich man's wife. A monster's wife, she said. That's what you're selling. You're selling me the chance to be a monster's wife instead of a poor man's daughter, and you want me to thank you. The silence between them was terrible. Somewhere out in the yard, a rooster called stupid and ordinary like this was any other day. He's coming Sunday, her father said, to make the arrangement. I'd ask you to be civil. Civil? Flora laughed, and there was no laughter in it. You'd ask me to be civil to the man buying me. Flora. I'll be there, she said. I'll be civil, but don't you ever again tell me you didn't have a choice. And she picked the shirt up out of the wash tub and went back to scrubbing, because there was nothing else in the whole world she could do with her 2 hands that would change one single thing about what was coming. He came on Sunday the way he said he would. Flora heard the horses before she saw them, and she stood in the doorway with her chin up and her hands folded in front of her because she had decided in the 3 sleepless nights between that she would not let this man see her afraid. Fear was a thing you gave people, and she was done giving away things she couldn't afford. There were 4 riders. 3 of them hung back near the gate, quiet watchful the way men do when they're used to guarding something. The 4th rode straight up to the house and swung down out of the saddle, and Flora got her first look at the man who was buying her life. Tucker Blackburn was tall, taller than she'd braced for. He moved slow, deliberate, like a man who had never in his life needed to hurry because the world had always waited on him. His face was hard and still, and gave up nothing weathered dark by sun, with eyes the pale gray of a winter sky that seemed to take in everything and offer back not one thing in return. He took off his hat when he saw her. She hadn't expected that. "Miss Newsom," he said. His voice was low and even. "I'm Tucker Blackburn." "I know who you are," Flora said. "Everybody knows who you are." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, just an acknowledgement. "I reckon they do," he said. Her father came out then, wiping his hands, too eager, too quick the way a man is when he's frightened and trying not to show it. "Mr. Blackburn, we're honored. Please come in. We've got coffee Flora made." "Pa," Flora said. "He's not here for coffee." The 2 men looked at her. Tucker Blackburn's pale eyes settled on her face and stayed there, and she made herself hold them, made herself not look away first. "No," Tucker agreed. "I'm not." "Then let's not pretend," Flora said. "You've come to close a deal. My father's told me the terms. You clear the debt, you leave us the land, and in return you get me. Is that the arrangement?" "Flora," her father hissed. But Tucker Blackburn held up one hand easy, and her father went quiet like a lamp turned down. "That's the arrangement," Tucker said. "Then I've got questions before I agree to being bought." "Flora, you don't agree to nothing, this ain't—" "Let her ask," Tucker said. And that surprised her so badly she lost her thread for a second. She had expected to be talked over, ordered, managed. She had not expected the feared wolf of the valley to stand in her father's dusty yard and tell her father to let her speak. "Why me?" she said. "That's your question. You could have any woman in the territory with money like yours, girls whose fathers would line up to hand them over gift-wrapped. So why come to a broke ranch in the middle of a drought and buy a girl who don't want you? Why me?" Tucker. Blackburn turned his hat in his hands once, and for just a moment, those pale eyes flicked away from her out toward the dead brown pasture, and Flora had the strange sense that she had asked something he did not intend to answer honestly. "Your father owes the bank," he said. "I own a piece of that bank. It's practical." "That's not an answer. That's an excuse." "It's the answer you're getting." "Then here's my next one," Flora said. "They say things about you, in town. You know what they say." "I know. They say you burned a family alive. They say you hanged a boy. They say you're the most dangerous man in this valley, and that folks who cross you disappear." She lifted her chin higher. "You want me to walk into your house and share your name?" So I'll ask it plain. Are those things true?" Her father made a sound like he was dying. The three men by the gate had gone very still. Even the wind seemed to hold. Tucker Blackburn looked at her for a long, long moment. "Some of them," he said. Flora felt the cold go all the way down through her. "Which ones?" she whispered. "That ain't a conversation for a Sunday yard," he said. "But I'll tell you this, Miss Newsom, and you can believe it or not. I've never harmed a soul that didn't earn it. I've never raised my hand to a woman in my life, and I never will. And whatever I am, I'm not the thing your town needs me to be. I'll not lie to you and call myself gentle, but I'll not be cruel to you. That much I can put my name to. That's supposed to comfort me." "No, ma'am," he said. "It's just the truth, and it's all I've got to offer you. I'd rather give you a hard truth than an easy lie. You'll find that's how it is with me if you come." Flora stared at him. And the terrible thing, the thing she would turn over and over in her mind for weeks after, was that she believed him. Not that he was safe, not that she was rescued, but that he was at least not lying to her in that moment. And she had spent so much of her life being lied to gently by people who claimed to love her that the plain hard honesty of a stranger struck her almost like a blow. "When?" she said. "Flora," her father started. "When would it happen?" she said, ignoring him, keeping her eyes on Tucker. "2 weeks," Tucker said. "The note comes due end of the month. I'd clear it before then. We'd wed quiet. No fuss. You'd have your own room, your own things, your own life inside my walls. I'd not ask of you anything you didn't offer freely." He paused. "You understand what I'm saying to you." She did. And she hated that she understood. It hated that he'd said it out loud in front of her father. Hated that the mere fact of a man promising not to take from her by force was the kindest thing anyone had offered her in a year. "I understand," she said. "Then I'll leave you to think on it." "I don't need to think on it," Flora said, and her voice was steady, and she was proud of that. "My father's already decided. We both know that. He decided the moment the bank called the note. All I get to decide is whether I walk in with my head up or get dragged, so I'll walk in. But hear me, Mr. Blackburn." She stepped down off the porch closer to him than any sensible person would stand to. The wolf of the valley, close enough to see that his eyes were not gray at all up close, but a pale worn blue, like something that had been left too long in the sun. "I'm not marrying you," she said. "I'm paying my father's debt. That's all this is. You clear the note, you get a woman under your roof, and you can tell the town whatever you like. But you'll never own the part of me that matters. Nobody will. Not you, not my father, not the whole state of Colorado. Do we understand each other?" Tucker Blackburn looked down at her. And for one flickering instant, something passed behind those tired, pale eyes. Something that was almost respect. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I believe we do." He put his hat back on, he mounted his horse, and he rode out of the yard with his 3 silent men without once looking back, and Harlan Newsom sank down onto the porch step and put his face in his hands, and Flora stood alone in the dead brown light and did not cry, because she had somewhere private saved up all her tears for a day. She might actually be able to spend them. The wedding 2 weeks later was the smallest and coldest thing Flora had ever stood inside of. There was a preacher who wouldn't meet her eye. There was her father in his one good coat, the one he'd worn to bury her mother, which struck her as fitting. There were the 3 silent men from the ranch standing at the back like fence posts. There was no music, no flowers, no neighbors, because half the town was too afraid to come to a Blackburn wedding, and the other half was too curious to be trusted. And there was Tucker Blackburn in a black coat hat in hand, watching her walk toward him down the little chapel aisle, the way you'd watch a storm you knew was coming and could not stop. She wore her mother's dress. It had yellowed some. It didn't fit right in the shoulders. She hadn't wanted to wear it, but it was the only thing she owned that looked anything like a bride, and she'd be damned if she'd let this town whisper that the wolf's wife had married in rags. The preacher spoke his words. Flora heard maybe 1 in 3 of them. She was aware of her own hands cold as creek stones folded in front of her. She was aware of the man beside her, the heat of him, the size of him, the silence of him. When the preacher asked, "Did she take this man?" she heard herself say, "I do," in a voice that sounded like it belonged to some other girl entirely, a girl who had chosen this, a girl who was not being sold. When the preacher pronounced them wed Tucker, Blackburn did not kiss her. He turned to face her, and he looked at her a long moment, and then he simply inclined his head, a small grave motion, almost a bow, and said low enough that only she could hear it. "Thank you, Miss Newsom." Not Mrs. Blackburn. Miss Newsom. As if he knew, as if he understood that she had not given herself to him and would not pretend she had. And that was worse somehow than if he'd grabbed her and kissed her hard in front of the whole cold room. Because cruelty she'd been ready for. Cruelty she'd built her walls against. She had no wall built for a monster who thanked her and called her by her own name. They rode out to Blackburn Ranch in a wagon, the two of them, with the three men riding escort front and back. Her father had hugged her before she climbed up, held her too tight, wet-eyed, and whispered, "I'm sorry, girl, I'm so sorry." And Flora had stood stiff in his arms and said nothing, because she had nothing left to say to him that wouldn't burn them both down. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. Flora watched the country roll by, watched the dead land slowly give way to greener land. Land with water still in it. Land that was clearly, unmistakably someone's careful work. Fences that stood straight. Cattle that looked fed. A world that had been drought-struck like everyone else's, and yet somehow had not died. "How?" she said at last, because the question got the better of her silence. "The whole valley's dying. How is your land green?" "Wells," Tucker said. "Dug deep 3 years back before the drought hit. Cost a fortune. Everybody in town called me a fool for spending it. And now they call you the wolf." "Now they call me whatever keeps them warm at night," he said. "A man with water in a drought is either a saint or a devil, depending who's telling it. I've never once been the saint." She looked at him sidelong. He kept his eyes on the road. "You dug wells before the drought," she said slowly. "That's not luck. That's not a devil's luck. That's a man who thought ahead, who planned, who took care of his people before the bad times came." "Careful, Mrs. Blackburn," he said, and there was the faintest dry edge to it. "You keep talking like that, folks might think you like me." "I don't like you," Flora said. "I don't know you. There's a difference." "There is," he agreed. "There surely is." And they rode the rest of the way to Blackburn Ranch in a silence that was not quite as cold as the one they'd started in. The house at Blackburn Ranch was bigger than any house Flora had ever set foot in. 2 full stories of good timber and stone with real glass in the windows, and a porch that wrapped the whole front. But it was the emptiness of it that struck her first, the way footsteps rang in it, the way it felt like a house built for a family that had never come. A woman met them at the door, older gray with a face like a closed fist, and hands that had clearly worked hard their whole life. Tucker introduced her as Mrs. Doheny, who kept the house. "This is my wife," Tucker said. "Flora. She'll want the east room, the big one with the window on the mountains. See, she has whatever she needs." Mrs. Doheny looked Flora up and down, taking her measure the way old women do, and something in her flat gaze softened, just slightly. "The east room," she repeated. That was to be. "The east room," Tucker said, and it was not sharp, but it was final, and Mrs. Doheny went quiet. Flora caught it, though. The half-sentence. The thing not said. That was to be. To be what? To be whose? She filed it away. Tucker turned to her, then hat still in his hands, standing in his own grand empty hallway like a man unsure of his welcome in his own home. "I've work to see to," he said. "I'll not crowd you. Mrs. Doheny will show you the house, the grounds, whatever you care to see. Supper's at 6, but if you'd rather take it in your room, that's yours to decide. Nobody here will trouble you. If any man on this ranch so much as looks at you wrong, you come tell me, and I'll see to it. You understand?" "Why?" Flora said. "Why what? Why are you being like this? Careful, distant. You paid for me. Half the men in this territory, they'd have—" She stopped. She made herself say it. "They'd have taken what they paid for. You're not. Why?" Tucker Blackburn looked at her, and for a moment, those pale eyes were not hard at all. They were only tired, and something underneath the tired that she couldn't name. "Because I didn't pay for you, Mrs. Blackburn," he said. "I paid a debt. There's a difference, like you said. You keep the part of you that matters. I meant that. I'll not be the man your town says I am. Not to you. Not ever." And he put his hat on and walked out, and Flora stood in the enormous empty hall, listening to his boots on the porch, and then his horse in the yard, and then nothing at all. And she thought, this is a trick. This has to be a trick. No man is this gentle for nothing. He's patient because patience is a longer kind of cruelty. He's waiting for me to relax, to soften, to trust him, and then the real Tucker Blackburn will come out. She thought that because it was safer to think it. She thought that because if she let herself believe even for one moment that the man was simply being kind, then she would have to feel all the fear she'd been holding at bay give way to something far more dangerous, which was hope. And Flora Newsome, who had learned young what happened to people who hoped, was not ready to feel that yet. The days at Blackburn Ranch settled into a strange rhythm that unsettled Flora precisely because it never gave her anything to fight. She kept waiting for the cruelty. She watched for it the way you'd watch a dog you'd been told would bite. She noted every closed door, every lowered voice, every time the men out in the yard went quiet as she passed, and she built each observation into the case she was constructing in her mind, the case that this whole gentle arrangement was a lie waiting to fall, but the cruelty never came. Instead, there was her room, the east room, the big one with the window on the mountains, and it was hers truly, hers with a lock on the inside of the door that Tucker himself had shown her the second night. "You'll want this," he'd said, standing well back in the hall, not crossing the threshold. "Turn it at night if it eases you. Nobody's got the other key. There isn't one. I had the lock changed before you came." And he'd left her the key in her own palm and walked away, and Flora had stood there, holding a key to a lock that only she could open, and had not known what on earth to do with the feeling in her chest. There was food, good food, more food than she'd seen since her mother died. There was Mrs. Doheny, gruff and short-worded, who nonetheless left an extra blanket folded at the foot of Flora's bed when the nights turned cold, and who, once seeing Flora eyeing the kitchen, had shoved a bowl and a spoon at her and said, "Well, don't just stand there gawking, make yourself useful," which had been, Flora slowly understood, the old woman's way of offering friendship. And there was Tucker, always at the edges, never in the center. He rose before dawn and worked till dark alongside his men. He took his supper across the long table from her most nights and asked her nothing she didn't want to answer and told her nothing she didn't ask. He tipped his hat to her every single time he passed her, a small grave gesture every time, like she was a lady and not a debt. It drove her half out of her mind. "You don't have to do that," she said one evening 3 weeks in, when he'd tipped his hat to her yet again in the hallway. "Do what?" "That. The hat. The ma'am. The manners. You act like I'm company. I'm not company. I'm the woman you bought to settle a debt. You don't owe me courtesy." Tucker paused, hand still at his hat brim. "A man's manners aren't about what he owes," he said. "They're about what he is." "And what are you?" He considered that. He always considered her questions. She'd noticed, turned them over, gave them real weight, never brushed them off. "Trying to be a man my mother wouldn't be ashamed of," he said finally. "It don't always work, but I try." "Your mother?" "She's gone. Long time now." "And she'd be ashamed of the wolf of the valley." Something crossed his face at that, a shadow. He looked at Flora a moment, and when he spoke his voice had gone quieter. "She never knew the wolf of the valley," he said. "She knew a boy named Tucker who dug her a garden and carried her water when her back went bad. The wolf came later, after she was gone, after I learned what the world does to men who let themselves be soft in it." He straightened. "Good night, Mrs. Blackburn," and he was gone down the hall before she could answer, and Flora stood there, with all her careful walls, all her armor of suspicion, and felt for the first time a crack running through them, thin as a hair, but there. The wolf came later, after I learned what the world does to men who let themselves be soft in it. She lay awake that night, turning it over. And she thought about her own self, about the girl who had once cried freely and hoped foolishly and trusted easily, and about the woman she'd made herself into since the one who didn't cry, who kept her tears saved up, who folded her hands and lifted her chin and gave nobody the satisfaction of her fear. She had become hard for exactly the same reason he had. Because the world had taught her that softness got you sold, and she did not like at all the discovery that she might have something in common with the wolf of the valley. The thing that finally cracked her open the rest of the way, though, was not a conversation. It was a boy. His name was Sam Cutter, and he was maybe 8 years old, and he belonged to one of the married hands who lived in the little row of homes Tucker had built out past the Barnes homes, with real floors and real chimneys, homes that no cattle baron in the whole territory bothered to build for his workers, because workers were cheap and homes were not. Flora came across this boy crying behind the barn one afternoon, holding his arm at a wrong angle, his face white with pain and fear. Sam, what happened? Let me see." "I fell," he sobbed, "off the fence. Pa told me not to climb it. He's gonna be so mad He's not gonna be mad," Flora said, already moving, already easing the arm, her mother's daughter, her mother, who'd set every broken bone within 10 miles because there was no doctor closer than a day's ride. "Hold still now. This is gonna hurt, but I got you. I got you. Look at me. What's your dog's name?" "Duke." "Duke? That's a fine name. You keep telling me about Duke while I—" And she set the arm quick clean, and the boy screamed. And then, blessedly, the pain of the setting passed into the duller pain of the set. And he was breathing again. And Flora was binding it with strips torn from her own petticoat, when a shadow fell over them both. She looked up, braced for the boy's frightened father. It was Tucker. He crossed the distance to them faster than she'd ever seen him move, and he dropped to one knee in the dirt beside the boy, and his hard, still face was not hard or still at all. It was open, it was afraid, it was gentle in a way that stopped Flora's breath. "Sam," he said. "Sam. Look at me, you all right? What happened? Tell me." "He fell off the fence," Flora said. "His arm was broke. I said it. It'll heal clean if he keeps it still." Tucker looked at the boy's bound arm. Then he looked at Flora, at her torn petticoat wound around a workman's son, at her steady hands, and something moved through his pale eyes that she had no name for. "You said it," he said. "My mother was a healer. I learned." Tucker turned back to the boy. He put one big, weathered hand very gently on the child's uninjured shoulder. "You listen to me, Sam Cutter," he said. "You're not in any trouble. You hear me? Boys climb fences. That's what boys do. Your pa won't lay a finger on you, and if he tries, he answers to me, but he won't try because he loves you, and a broke arm is punishment enough. Now, you did a brave thing just now, holding still while Mrs. Blackburn fixed you up. That took sand. I'm proud of you. You understand me." The boy nodded, tears drying, staring up at the feared wolf of the valley with the naked adoration only a child can give. "Can I still see the new colt?" Sam asked. "When your arm's healed," Tucker said, "you'll be the first one I show it to. That's a promise. And I don't break promises to men who take a fall like that and don't quit crying too long about it." The boy actually laughed, wet and hiccuping, and Tucker helped him up and walked him back toward the little row of homes, with his hand on the boy's good shoulder, the whole way, matching his long stride to the child's short one. And Flora stood there in the dust with her ruined petticoat and watched the wolf of the valley carry an injured child home like the most precious cargo in Colorado. And something inside her that had been clenched shut for a very long time began terrifyingly to open. He came back a while later and found her still there where he'd left her, staring at nothing. "His father thanks you," Tucker said. "So do I. That boy means a great deal to a great many people here." "They're not afraid of you," Flora said. "Who? Them. The families. That boy looked at you like—" She shook her head. "The town says you hang children. That boy looked at you like you hung the moon. Both of those can't be true." Tucker was quiet. "No," he said. "They can't. So, which one is it?" And Tucker Blackburn looked at her for a long time, and the sun was going down behind him, and finally he said, "Walk with me a minute, Mrs. Blackburn. There's things I reckon it's time you knew, and I'd rather you hear them from me than keep building me into a monster out of town gossip in my own bad silence." Flora's heart was pounding. She didn't know why. She only knew that she was standing at the edge of something, a truth she'd both dreaded and hungered for, since the first day her father said that terrible name in the kitchen. "All right," she said. "Then talk. And Tucker." It was the first time she'd used his given name. She saw him notice it. "Don't you dare give me an easy lie. You said you'd rather give me a hard truth. So give it to me." "Yes, ma'am," Tucker Blackburn said quietly. "I believe I will." And he began to walk, and she walked beside him out toward the green land he'd fought the whole dying world to keep alive. And the last of the daylight went gold and then gray around them. And Flora Newsome, who had come to this place, certain she'd been handed to a monster, felt the story she'd told herself about her own life begin quietly to come apart at the seams. They walked a long way in the failing light before Tucker spoke, and when he did, his voice was low and even, the voice of a man laying down something heavy he'd carried a great distance. "You want to know about the fire," he said. "The one they say I set, the family they say I burned." "I want to know all of it," Flora said. "But start there. Start with the worst thing they say." "The worst thing they say is the one with the most twist in it," he said. "So I'll start there. There was a fire. That part's true. A ranch burned the Kettleman place 11 years back, and folks died in it. That's true too. 3 of them." He was quiet a moment. "But I didn't set it. And I'll tell you what I did do, and you can decide for yourself what kind of man that makes me." "Tell me." "The Kettlemans ran cattle they didn't own," Tucker said. "Rustlers. Been at it for years, taking beef off half the valley, mine included, mine most of all." This was lawless country then, Flora. No law closer than 3 days' ride, and that law bought and paid for by men worse than the rustlers. A man protected his own, or he lost everything. So when I finally caught them dead to rights with my brand on the hides in their own barn, I rode out with my men to take back what was mine and see them run out of the valley. And the fire. One of theirs fired on us first. A lamp got knocked over in the scuffle in the barn with all that dry hay. His jaw tightened. "It went up like paper, and I lost 2 of my own men trying to pull the Kettlemans out of it, Flora. 2 good men. Died trying to save the very rustlers who'd been stealing us blind. We got some of them out. 3 we didn't. And I have carried those 3 every day of my life since, though not one of them was a soul I'd have chosen to save if choosing came into it, because a man doesn't choose who burns." Flora had stopped walking. "That's not the story they tell in town." "No," Tucker said. "The story they tell in town is that the wolf burned a family alive to take their land, and I never once corrected it." "Why not, Tucker? Why wouldn't you people think you're a murderer? Why would you let them—" "Because the same men who'd been stealing my cattle stopped stealing it," Tucker said, and his voice had gone hard and old. "Overnight, every rustler in the valley heard the wolf burn the Kettlemans alive, and every rustler in the valley decided my beef wasn't worth the risk. Nobody touched a Blackburn cow for years. A lie kept my ranch alive, Flora. A lie kept food on the tables of every family that works this land, and I let it stand. That's the truth. I let a whole town believe I was a monster because a monster was a thing nobody dared to rob." Flora stood very still in the gray light. "The boy," she said. "They say you hanged a boy. A thief." "There was a boy," Tucker said. 15. Caught him stealing tack from my barn. Town says I hanged him." He turned and looked at her full on. "I gave him a job. He's 26 now, and he runs my whole North Range, and his name is Elias, and he'd take a bullet for me, and I'd take one for him. That's the boy I hanged, Flora. I hanged a rope of responsibility around a starving kid's neck and made him into a man. But Blackburn took in an orphan thief and raised him up. That don't frighten anybody. The wolf hanged a boy. Now that keeps folks off my land." Flora's eyes had gone hot. She pressed her lips together hard. "How many?" she said. "How many of the stories are lies?" "Most of them," Tucker said quietly. Not all. I've done hard things. I've done things in this valley in lawless years that I won't pretty up for you things a gentler world would have called crimes, and this one called survival. I've put men in the ground who came onto my land to kill me and mine. I won't kneel here and tell you my hands are clean because they aren't, and you'd know I was lying and I promised you no easy lies. But burning families, hanging children, terrorizing the innocent. He shook his head slowly. No. That's the town's monster. That's the wolf they built because they needed one. And I fed him Flora. Every year I kept my mouth shut and let them believe it. I fed the thing that made you look at me on our wedding day like I was going to devour you. I made that fear. On purpose. It kept me safe. It kept my people safe. His voice dropped. And then one day I looked up and understood it had also made me a man that no decent woman would ever choose. That I'd built a wall so high to keep out my enemies that I'd walled out the whole rest of my life along with them. The words hung in the darkening air. That's why you married me, Flora said slowly. The understanding was breaking over her cold and clear. Isn't it? That's the real answer to the question I asked you in my father's yard. Not the bank, not practicality. Tucker didn't answer. He looked away out at the mountains going black against the last light. You said you'd rather give me a hard truth than an easy lie, Flora said. So give it to me. Why me, Tucker Blackburn? Why did the wolf of the valley go to a broke, drought-struck ranch and buy a girl who spat in his face on their wedding day? And don't you tell me it was the debt. You've got money enough to buy 100 debts. Why me? And Tucker Blackburn feared across 3 counties, master of 20,000 acres. The man the whole town called Monster turned to face his wife in the last of the light, and for the first time since she'd met him, his voice was not even at all. It shook just slightly, just enough. Because I saw you, he said. 2 years back. In town. Before any of this. You didn't see me. I was nobody to you, just a man across the street. But there was a girl outside the mercantile, and some drunk fool was laying into a little Mexican boy who'd bumped him raising a hand to a child, and every grown man on that street just watched. And this girl, this slip of a thing, she stepped between them. Put herself between a grown drunk man and a child that wasn't even hers, and she looked that man dead in the eye and she said, Tucker's throat worked. She said, you'll have to come through me first and I promise you I bite. Flora felt the ground move under her. I don't remember. You wouldn't, Tucker said softly. It was nothing to you. You did it and you walked on and you forgot it by supper. But I didn't forget it, Flora. I stood across that street, and I watched a girl with no money and no name, and nothing in this world to protect her, put her own body between cruelty and a helpless child, and do it without 1 second's hesitation, and I thought... He stopped. He pressed on. I thought, there's a person who's got what I lost. There's somebody who's still soft enough to step in front of a stranger's boy, and hard enough to make a grown man back down doing it. There's somebody who never let the world turn her into a wolf, and I thought if I ever got the chance, he couldn't finish it. You waited? Flora whispered. 2 years. I told myself it was foolishness. I told myself a woman like that would never look twice at a man like me, and she'd be right not to. And then the drought came, and your father's note came due, and I... His hands closed into fists at his sides. I know how it looks. I know what I did. I used your father's ruin to put you in my house, and there's no way to make that clean, and I've hated myself for it every day. You've been under my roof, looking at me like I bought you. Because you're right, I did. I did buy you, and it was the lowest thing I ever did, and I did it anyway, because I could not stand the thought of you being sold to somebody else who wouldn't know what they had. So I gave you the lock, and the room, and the distance, and I swore I'd never take one thing you didn't offer, because it was the only way I could live with what I'd done. I'd rather have you hate me safe under my roof than love somebody kinder somewhere I couldn't keep you from harm. The dark had come full now. Flora could barely see his face, but she could hear the man behind the wolf, the boy who dug his mother a garden, The man who'd let a whole town call him a killer to protect the families sleeping in the homes he'd built them. The man who had chosen her 2 years before. She'd ever known his name for the one moment of her life she was proudest of and had entirely forgotten. "You should hate me," Tucker said into the dark. "It'd be the sensible thing. I won't blame you for it. I've made my own bed 100 times over." And Flora Newsom, who did not cry, who had saved up every tear for a day. She could spend it, who had walked into this marriage, certain she'd been handed to a monster, stood in the dark beside her husband, and felt the whole careful structure of her life. Every wall, every lie she'd been told, and every lie she'd told herself, come down all at once. "You're a damned fool, Tucker Blackburn," she said, and her voice broke clean in half. "You're a damned fool, and you're a liar, and you let a whole town believe you're a monster, and you bought me like a heifer at auction, and you're the only person in my entire life who ever chose me for the thing about myself I actually like." He went still. "Flora, I'm not saying I forgive you," she said fiercely, wiping at her face with the back of her hand, furious at the tears, furious at him, furious at the whole cruel world that had made two people this hard, for no crime worse than wanting to survive it. "I'm not saying that. What you did buying me using my father's ruin, that was low, and you're right, there's no way to make it clean, and I'm going to be angry about it for a good long while." "You've got every right, but I'm not afraid of you anymore," Flora said. "That's what I'm telling you, whatever else you are, Tucker Blackburn. I am not one bit afraid of you. And I've spent 2 weeks in your house waiting for the monster to come out. And I understand now he's never coming. Because there is no monster. There's just a lonely man who built a scarecrow to keep the crows off and then forgot to climb down out of the field himself." For a long moment, Tucker Blackburn couldn't speak at all. "I don't know what to do with that," he said at last hoarse. "Nobody's talked to me like a man in 11 years. Everybody either bows or runs. I don't know how to be looked at straight anymore. I forgot how." "Well," Flora said, and she drew a breath, shaky, and lifted her chin the way she always did, the way she'd done in her father's yard, and the cold little chapel, and every hard moment of her hard life. "You're going to have to learn, because I am not going to bow to you, and I am not going to run from you, and I'll be damned if I spend the rest of whatever this marriage is talking to a wall. So you'd best get used to being looked at straight, Tucker, starting now, because I intend to do a great deal of it." And in the dark, out on the green land, he'd fought the whole dying world to keep. The wolf of the valley made a sound that was half a laugh and half something that had been locked up in him for 11 long years and was only now at last finding a crack to come out through. "Yes, ma'am," Tucker Blackburn said. "I reckon I will." They walked back to the house together in the dark, not touching, not speaking, a careful foot of space still between them. But it was a different silence than the one they'd started their marriage inside of. It was not the silence of a captive and her captor. It was the silence of two people who had each in their own separate and stubborn ways survived a world that tried to turn them cruel, and who had just discovered against every expectation that they had found in each other the one other person for 100 miles who understood exactly what that had cost. Flora went up to the east room, the big one with the window on the mountains. She turned the lock out of habit the way she did every night. Then she stood there a moment, her hand on the cold iron key. And for the first time since she'd come to Blackburn Ranch, Flora Newsom turned the lock back open and left her door unlocked and lay down in the dark and slept better than she had in a year. The morning after Flora Newsom left her door unlocked, she woke to the sound of a man shouting in the yard, and every old instinct in her snapped awake at once. She was down the stairs before she'd finished pinning her hair, and she found Mrs. Doheny standing at the front window with her arms folded and her face like a shut door. "What is it?" Flora said. "Who's shouting?" "Trouble in a good coat," Mrs. Doheny said. "Same as it always is." Out in the yard sat a fine black buggy, finer than anything that belonged in cattle country, and beside it stood a man in a gray town suit with a watch chain across his belly and a smile that never once reached his eyes. Tucker stood facing him, hat on, hands loose, and even from the porch, Flora could read the set of her husband's shoulders. She'd seen that set before in dogs, right before the growl. Only saying, Blackburn, that folks in town are asking questions, the man in gray was saying. A drought like this, a man with green land and full water, why it invites talk, envious talk. And you know how talk turns in a town that already believes what it believes about you. Say what you came to say, Vane, Tucker said. I've got work. Cyrus Vane. Flora filed the name. I came to say the bank would be pleased to buy your South Wells, Vane said pleasantly. At a generous figure. Water that could serve the whole valley instead of one man's private cattle. You'd be a hero. Might even soften some of those, unfortunate stories about you. His smile widened. A man in your position can't afford to be hated forever, Tucker. Sooner or later, hate finds a rope. You're threatening me, Tucker said, on my own land, over my own water, and dressing it up as kindness. Get in your buggy, Vane. I'm advising you. Get in your buggy. And Flora, watching from the porch, saw the exact moment Cyrus Vane's eyes slid past Tucker and found her. Saw the smile change. Saw it turn into something calculating and slow. Well now, Vane said. The famous new bride, the Newsom girl. He tipped his hat to her with an insolence that made her skin crawl. I knew your father, miss. Fine man. Terrible manager. He'll be pleased to hear you've landed so comfortably. A pause precise as a knife. For as long as it lasts. You'll speak to my wife with respect, Tucker said low, or you won't speak at all. Oh, I mean her every respect. Vane climbed into his buggy, unhurried, a man who had all the time in the world because he believed the world already belonged to him. I only wonder if she knows what she married. Whether her daddy told her the whole story before he sold her, or just the price. He gathered the reins. Good day, Mrs. Blackburn. When you tire of the wolf and you will, the bank keeps regular hours. And he drove out, and the dust of him hung in the yard a long time after the buggy was gone. Tucker didn't move for a moment. Then he turned and looked up at her on the porch. And whatever was in his face, he wiped clean before she could read it. You shouldn't have heard that, he said. I've heard worse, Flora said. Who is he? Cyrus Vane. Runs the bank. The one that held your father's note. Tucker climbed the porch steps slow. The one I bought a piece of to clear it. He wants your wells. He's wanted my wells 3 years, since before the drought made them worth killing for. Tucker took off his hat, turned it in his hands. Vane's been buying up every dry ranch in the valley for pennies, waiting them out. Only piece of country he can't get is mine, because I've got the one thing his money can't buy in a drought, which is water. And a man like Vane, he doesn't lose. He just changes the game till he wins. And the stories, Flora said slowly. The monster stories. You told me you kept them alive because they protected you. But the understanding came cold. He spreads them too, doesn't he? The wolf of the valley. It serves him. Keeps the town hating you so that when he finally moves against you, nobody lifts a finger. Tucker looked at her, and there was something almost like grief in it. You catch on quick, he said. My mother didn't raise a fool. What's he planning? I don't know yet. Tucker set his jaw. But he came here to look at you. That's what that was. He didn't come for the wells. He's asked for the wells a dozen times. He came to see my wife, to see if you were a weakness. His voice dropped. And now he knows I've got one. Flora's chin came up. I'm not a weakness. You're the first thing in 11 years I couldn't stand to lose, Tucker said plainly, which is the same as a weakness to a man like Vane. He'll use you if he can find a way. I need you to be careful, Flora, when you go to town, who you talk to, what you let slip. I'm not going to hide in your house, Tucker. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to be smart. He held her eyes. Can you do that for me? Please. It was the please that got her. She'd heard him give orders to grown men who jumped to obey. She'd never once heard him say please to anyone. I can be smart, she said. I've been smart my whole life. It's how I'm still standing. She paused. But Tucker, if that man thinks he can use me against you, he's about to learn the same thing that drunk outside the mercantile learned. I bite. And something broke open in Tucker Blackburn's hard face, something warm and disbelieving, and he said, "Yes, ma'am. I don't doubt it one bit." And for just a moment, standing there in the settling dust, the two of them almost smiled. The almost smile didn't last, because that was the day Flora finally learned about the East Room. It happened by accident. She was helping Mrs. Doheny turn out a closet at the far end of the upstairs hall, a closet that hadn't been opened in years by the smell of it. And near the back, wrapped in an old sheet, she found a cradle. It was hand-carved. Beautiful. The work of a man who'd spent long, careful hours on it, sanding every edge smooth, so a small hand couldn't catch a splinter. And it had never been used. She could tell it had never been used the way you can tell a Sunday dress has never been worn. "Mrs. Doheny," Flora said quietly. "Whose is this?" The old woman went still. For a long moment she said nothing at all. Then she took the sheet from Flora's hands and drew it back up over the cradle gentle, the way you'd cover a sleeping child. "That's not for me to tell," she said. "Mrs. Doheny, ask him." The old woman's voice was rough. "It's his sorrow to give, not mine. But I'll tell you this, girl, and then not another word." She looked at Flora hard. "That room you're sleeping in. The East Room, the big one with the mountains in the window. He built this whole house around that room, years back, long before you. He built it for somebody, and she never got to sleep in it. And that man has not let one living soul use that room from that day to this." Her eyes glittered. "Until you. He gave it to you your first hour in this house. Now you think on what that means, and you don't you ever tell him I said a word." And she carried the cradle back into the dark of the closet and shut the door, and Flora stood in the hall, with her heart going hard, because she had walked into this marriage certain she understood everything about it, and she was learning day by day that she'd understood nothing at all. She didn't ask him that night. She couldn't find the words. But she watched him at supper across the long table, watched the careful way he held himself, the loneliness in him. She'd been too afraid to see it first. And she thought about a cradle no baby had ever slept in, and a room no woman had ever used. And she thought he lost somebody. He lost somebody the way I lost my mother, the way that carves a person hollow and teaches them to build walls. And she understood him a little more, and she was afraid of him a little less, and both of those things frightened her more than his monster reputation ever had, because fear you could arm yourself against, but tenderness snuck up on you unguarded. The first time she saw the town turn on him with her own eyes was market day. She'd gone in with Elias, the young man who ran Tucker's North Range, the boy Tucker was supposed to have hanged, and had instead raised into a man. He drove the wagon and told her stories. The whole way, funny ones, easy ones, a young man plainly devoted to the man who'd saved him, and Flora liked him at once, liked him. "He gave me a choice," Elias said, when she asked him straight out about the hanging story. "I was 15 and starving, and I broke into his barn to steal a saddle to sell. He caught me by the collar, and I was sure I was dead. Everybody knew what the wolf did to thieves. And he looked at me a long time, and he said, 'Boy, you can hang for a saddle, or you can work off what you tried to take and eat regular while you do it. Which one you want?'" Elias laughed. "I've been working it off 11 years. Reckon I'm about square." He sobered. "That's the man, ma'am. That's the real one. But you can't tell folks in town that. They don't want the real one. They like the wolf better. A wolf simpler." She understood exactly what he meant an hour later in the mercantile. She'd gone to the counter with her list, and the shopkeeper, a thin, sour man named Pruitt, had taken one look at her and gone cold as a well. "Blackburn credit's no good here," he said before she'd said a word. "I've got cash money," Flora said. "Blackburn cash, then." Pruitt folded his arms. "I don't sell to that house. My conscience won't allow it." "Your conscience?" Flora set her basket down on the counter slow. "That's interesting, Mr. Pruitt, because I heard your conscience allowed you to sell to that house just fine for 11 years, right up until Cyrus Vane started buying up dry ranches and needed a reason for the whole town to hate the one man he couldn't buy out. When did your conscience get so particular? Was it around the time Vane bought your neighbor's spread cheap?" The shop went quiet. Two women near the dry goods stopped pretending not to listen. You watch your mouth, girl, Pruitt said, but his ears had gone red. I'm asking an honest question. You call my husband a monster. Fine. Tell me what he did to you. Not what you heard. Not what Cyrus Vane's men whisper at the saloon. What did Tucker Blackburn ever do to you, Mr. Pruitt, personally with his own 2 hands, that you'd refuse cash money and let a child go without her flour? Everybody knows what the Kettlemans were rustlers, Flora said clearly, so the whole store could hear it. Who stole from every rancher in this valley, including 2 men who died in that fire trying to save them. Ask anybody old enough to remember before the story got pretty. Ask them who lost cattle to the Kettlemans. Go on. I'll wait. Nobody said anything. And one of the women by the dry goods, an older woman with a weathered, kind face, said quietly, She's not wrong, Amos. My Henry lost 40 head to those Kettlemans, cried about it at this very counter. You sold him the coffee to get over it. Pruitt's jaw worked. His hands were shaking a little now. I want my flour, my coffee, my sugar, and my thread, Flora said, and I want it weighed honest, and I've got the coin for all of it. Now, are you a shopkeeper, Mr. Pruitt, or are you Cyrus Vane's errand boy? Because I can't for the life of me tell which, and I'd hate to shop somewhere that couldn't decide. For a long, terrible moment she thought he'd throw her out. And then, red to the roots of his hair, Amos Pruitt reached under the counter for the flour scoop and weighed out her order and took her coin and never once met her eye. And when Flora walked out of that store with her basket full and her chin high, the kind-faced older woman fell in beside her on the boardwalk. That took sand, Mrs. Blackburn, the woman said. Nobody stood up to Pruitt in a year. He's gone strange since Vane got his hooks in. They all have. He's not the only one, is he? Flora said. Vane's turned the whole town. Vane's bought the whole town, the woman said grimly. Bought it with debt and fear, same as he tried to buy your daddy. The only thing he can't buy is your husband's water. And a man like that... She glanced around, lowered her voice. A man like that don't stop, dear. You be careful. He's already killed 1 ranch this year that wouldn't sell. Fire took it. Funny thing about fires in this valley, they always seem to help Cyrus Vane. Flora went cold to her boots. What was the ranch? She said. The Delacroix place, out east. Burned to the ground in the spring, whole family got out but lost everything, had to sell to the bank for pennies to survive. The woman's mouth was a hard line. And you know whose name folks whispered when it burned? Not Vane's, never Vane's. She looked at Flora. They whispered the wolf did it, Blackburn did it. Because who else burns ranches in this valley? And Vane didn't say a word to stop them. Just bought the Delacroix land cheap and let your husband take the blame. The wagon ride home, Flora couldn't speak for the fury in her. That night, she waited until the house was quiet, and then she went to find Tucker, and she found him in the room he used for an office, bent over the ranch books by lamplight, and she shut the door behind her and said, The Delacroix Ranch, tell me about it. Tucker looked up slow. Something flickered in his face. Who told you about the Delacroix Ranch? A woman in town. Kind eyes, sharp tongue. Said her Henry lost cattle to the Kettlemans. That's Ada Vernon. She's one of maybe 3 people in that town still worth a damn. Tucker set down his pen. What did she tell you? She told me the Delacroix Ranch burned in the spring, and Vane bought it cheap, and the whole town blamed you. Flora crossed the room and put both hands flat on his desk and leaned into his tired, pale eyes. So I'm going to ask you the same thing I asked you about the Kettlemans, and you're going to give me the same hard truth you promised me. Did you burn the Delacroix Ranch? No, Tucker said, without one heartbeat's hesitation. Do you know who did? And there it was, the flicker again, the thing behind his eyes. Tucker. I've got a suspicion, he said. I've got no proof, and a suspicion in this valley gets a man killed if he's fool enough to speak it out loud. Vane, Flora said. It was Vane, or Vane's men. I said I've got no proof. But you think it. Tucker was quiet a long moment. Then he stood and he moved to the window, and he stood with his back to her, looking out at the dark. And when he spoke, his voice was low and hard. The Delacroix family were friends of mine, he said. about the only ones I had left. Old Emile Delacroix, he never once believed the stories about me. Used to say, Tucker, a man who builds houses for his workers, doesn't burn houses down, and any fool who can't see that isn't worth explaining it to. A muscle worked in his jaw. Vane wanted the Delacroix water rights. Emile said no 3 times. And in the spring, their house burned in the night, and they got out with what they wore. And by summer they'd signed everything over to the bank for 1/10 of its worth, just to have money to start over somewhere else. And the whole town said the wolf did it. He turned. And I stood at Emile Delacroix's wagon the day he left this valley my friend ruined, and he looked at me. Flora, and I saw the doubt in his eyes. Even him. Even Emile. He looked at me for 1 second like he wondered if it was true. And that... Tucker's voice cracked. That was the day I understood what I'd done to myself. Building the wolf. I made myself into a thing that even my friends could believe would burn them out. I did that. Vane just used the door I'd already built. Flora's throat was tight. So you'll let him, she said. You'll let Vane do to you what he did to the Delacroix. You'll just wait for the fire. I've got more men than Emile did. More water. I'm harder to burn. You're not answering me. You'll just wait. What would you have me do? Tucker said, rounding on her, and there was real anguish in it now. Ride into town and accuse the banker with no proof, get myself arrested by the sheriff he owns, give him the excuse he's been praying for to call me a killer to my face and hang me legal. I've spent 11 years keeping my people safe by being patient, Flora. By waiting. By not giving them the fight they want. Patience is the only weapon I've got that Vane can't buy. Patience didn't save the Delacroix ranch. The words rang in the small room. Tucker stared at her, and Flora, breathing hard, stared back, and neither of them looked away. No, Tucker said finally quietly. It didn't. Then we need a better weapon, Flora said. We need proof. We need the town to see what Vane really is. We need to give them back the truth they traded away for a simpler story. She straightened. You've spent 11 years feeding the wolf, Tucker. Maybe it's time somebody killed it. Maybe it's time this town met the real Tucker Blackburn, whether they like him or not. They won't like him, Tucker said. The real one's not simple. The real one's got blood on his hands from the lawless years. The real one is a harder sell than the wolf ever was. Let me worry about selling, Flora said. I sold my own self to save my father's ranch. I reckon I can sell one honest man to a town that's forgotten what one looks like. She held out her hand across the desk. Are you with me or not, Tucker Blackburn? Because I didn't marry a monster, and I didn't marry a coward, and if you sit in this house and wait for Cyrus Vane to burn us out the way he burned out your friend, then I married the wrong man after all. For a long moment, Tucker Blackburn looked at his wife's outstretched hand like it was the first honest thing anyone had offered him in a decade. Then he took it. All right, he said. God help us both. All right. The proof, when it came from the last place Flora expected. It came from her father. Harlan Newsom rode out to Blackburn Ranch on a borrowed horse 3 weeks later, and Flora watched him come up the road and felt every hard thing in her chest lock into place, because she had not spoken one word to the man who sold her since the day of her wedding. She met him in the yard with her arms folded and her face like winter. Flora, her father said, dismounting stiff. Girl, you look well. What do you want, Pa? He flinched at the flatness of it. I deserve that, he said. I know I do. I came, Flora. I came because I've got to tell you something, and I've been too much a coward to tell it, and it's been eating me alive. He wrung his hands. It's about Vane, about the bank, about how I lost the ranch. Flora went still. The drought didn't ruin us alone, Harlan said low and ashamed. I've done the sums 100 times since. The drought hurt, sure. But we'd have survived the drought. Flora, plenty of ranches survived it. What broke us was the note. Vane's note. He called it early. He had no cause to call it early. The terms gave me 2 more years. But he called it all at once, whole thing, and when I begged him, he just smiled and said the bank had its reasons. Harlan's voice shook. And I found out later. From a man who used to work at the bank before Vane ran him off. I found out why he called my note. Why? Flora whispered. Because of you. Harlan couldn't look at her. Vane called my note to force a sale. He wanted my land, Flora. Same as he wants everybody's. Cheap. He figured I'd have to sell it to the bank for nothing to cover the debt and he'd add it to his pile. That was the whole plan. Ruin the Newsoms, take the land. He drew a ragged breath. But then Blackburn stepped in. Cleared the whole note. Took you instead of the land. And Vane Flora Vane was furious. The man who told me he said Vane threw a fit like a child. Because he'd set his trap for my land and Blackburn had walked in and paid the whole thing and snatched it out from under him and gotten the girl besides. Vane's hated your husband a long time, but that was the day it turned personal. Blackburn made a fool of him. And Cyrus Vane does not forgive being made a fool. Flora stood very still in the yard. Pieces were turning in her mind, sliding into place, and the shape they made was terrible. Pa, she said slowly, when Vane called your note, did he know Tucker would step in and clear it? How could he? Nobody knew Blackburn would. But could Tucker have known? Flora pressed. Could Tucker have found out Vane was going to ruin you and moved first and cleared the note before Vane could take the land? Is that possible? Her father stared at her. I never thought. He shook his head. The offer came so fast, girl. Vane called the note on a Monday. Blackburn's offer came Thursday. 3 days. That's fast. That's awful fast for a man to hear of a note and put together that kind of money and... He stopped. His eyes widened. You think he was watching? You think Blackburn was watching Vane, watching me? And Flora, standing in the yard, understood at last the whole shape of what her husband had done. He hadn't just bought her on a whim. He hadn't just used her father's ruin. He'd been watching Cyrus Vane pick off ranches one by one for years. And when Vane moved against the Newsoms, against the family of the girl, Tucker had never forgotten the girl who'd stepped in front of a drunk to protect a child 2 years before Tucker had moved to stop him. He'd cleared the note not to buy a bride, but to keep Cyrus Vane from destroying her family. And taking her hand in marriage had been the only way in this hard world he could do it without shaming her father into refusing charity. Everything she'd thought was cruelty had been protection, wearing the only mask the world would let it wear. Oh, Flora said softly. Oh, you stubborn, foolish, prideful man. Flora, not you, Pa. She wiped her eyes hard, furious at herself. Tucker, my husband. He saved you, Pa. He saved our whole family from Vane, and he did it in a way that let you keep your pride and keep the land, and he took the blame for buying me, so you'd never have to feel like a man who couldn't provide. And I spat in his face for it. I threw his ring at his boots and called him a monster, and Her voice broke. God forgive me, I've been so angry at the one man in the whole world who... Flora, her father said gently. He reached out hesitant, and when she didn't pull away, he took her hand. Girl, you didn't know. How could you have known? I didn't know myself till a month ago, and I'm the one it happened to. He swallowed. But I know something else now, too. I know why I really came out here. It wasn't just to confess. It was because Vane came to see me, last week, and what he said scared me bad enough to make me brave enough to face you. Flora's blood went cold. What did he say? He said... Harlan's voice dropped. He said your husband's luck was about to run out. He said there were men coming to this valley. Hard men Vane had sent for. And that soon enough, the wolf of the valley would learn what happened to men who made a fool of Cyrus Vane. And then he smiled at me. Flora, that awful smile. And he said, you might want to bring your daughter home before it gets messy. A wolf's den's no place for a girl when the hunters come. Harlan gripped her hand hard. Come home, Flora. Please. Whatever's coming, come home where it's safe. And Flora Newsom looked at her father, at his frightened face, at the man who had once carried her through a meadow and told her she was worth more than the whole state of Colorado, and then had sold her and now stood begging her to run. No, she said. Flora, no, Pa. This is my home now. That man in there is my husband, and I'm not going to run from a fight and leave him to face it alone because that's exactly what Vane wants. That's why he came to you, so you'd draw me out, so Tucker would have one less thing worth fighting for. She lifted her chin. You want to make it up to me, for selling me, for all of it. Then help me. Ride to every ranch Vane ruined. The Delacroix if you can find where they went. Anybody Vane cheated, anybody who lost land to a fire, anybody who knows the truth. We're going to gather it up, all of it. Every ugly true thing Cyrus Vane has done in this valley. And we're going to bring it into the light where the whole town can see it. That's how you make it right, Pa. Not by taking me home, by helping me save it. Harlan Nuzam looked at his daughter for a long moment, and something came into his broken face that Flora hadn't seen there since before her mother died. It was pride. Pride in her. Your mother, he said thickly, would be so proud of the woman you turned into, and so ashamed of the man I turned into. But I'll do it, girl. I'll do it. Every ranch, every name. If it kills me, I'll help you save your home. He gripped her hand. It's the least a man owes the daughter he sold. She told Tucker everything that night, and she watched his face change as she talked. Watched the moment he understood that she knew. Knew the whole truth of what he'd done. Knew he'd saved her family and taken the blame to spare her father's pride. You weren't supposed to find that out, Tucker said quietly when she'd finished. Your father wasn't supposed to. That was between me and Vane. You were never supposed to know I did it for... He stopped. For me, Flora said. Say it. You did it for me. Because of a girl you saw step in front of a drunk 2 years before you ever spoke to her. Yes, Tucker said. For you. Flora crossed the room. And for the first time since she'd come to Blackburn Ranch, she did not stop at a careful foot of distance. She stood close enough to feel the heat of him, close enough to see her own reflection in his tired, pale eyes. And she reached up and put one hand flat against his chest over his heart and felt it hammering this hard, silent man, hammering like a boy's. I threw your ring at your boots, she said. In the barn, our wedding day. Do you remember what you said? I remember every word you've ever said to me, Tucker said hoarsely, and every word I've ever said back. You said what you are to me that ain't decided yet. That part's still yours. She looked up at him. Well, I've decided, Tucker Blackburn. It took me long enough, and I fought it the whole way, and God knows you made it hard by being so stubborn and so silent, and so determined to let the whole world think the worst of you. But I've decided. Flora, his voice was barely there. Don't say it because you're grateful. Gratitude's not... I couldn't stand it if it was only gratitude. I'd rather have your honest hate than your grateful pity. I mean that It's not gratitude, you fool man. And Flora Nuzam rose up on her toes and kissed her husband, kissed him full and hard and honest. Both hands fisted in his shirt, kissed him the way she'd never once kissed anyone in her whole hard, careful life. And for one frozen heartbeat, Tucker Blackburn stood absolutely still like a man who could not believe the thing that was happening to him. And then his arms came around her, careful, even now, careful and trembling. And he kissed her back like a man who had been starving in silence for 11 years, and had just been told he was allowed to eat. When they broke apart, they were both breathing hard, foreheads together, and Tucker made a sound like a laugh and a sob all at once. I don't deserve this, he said. I bought you. Whatever the reason, I bought you, and you shouldn't. You didn't buy this, Flora said fiercely against his mouth. Nobody bought this. This part was always mine to give. Remember. You told me so yourself, and I'm giving it. To you. Because you're the only person in my whole life who ever wanted the part of me that bites, and God help me, Tucker. I think I love you, and I'm terrified, and I've never said that word to a living soul. So you'd best not make me say it twice. You won't have to, Tucker Blackburn whispered. You won't ever have to say a hard thing twice to me long as I live. I'll hear you the first time. Every time. And he kissed her again, gentle, now reverent, like a man handling something he'd waited his whole life to be trusted with, and out past the window. The dark land lay quiet and green and waiting, and for one night, one single stolen night, Cyrus Vane and his hard-hired men and his coming fire felt very far away. But they weren't far away. They came 4 days later, and they didn't come with fire. Vane was too clever for fire now that the town had a Blackburn wife stirring up questions. He came with the law. The sheriff rode out to Blackburn Ranch with 6 deputies and a paper in his hand, and Flora watched from the porch with her heart in her throat as Tucker walked out to meet them, and she saw the sheriff, a heavy man named Coombs, who wouldn't meet Tucker's eye, hold up the paper and clear his throat. "Tucker Blackburn," Coombs said. "I got a warrant for your arrest." The yard went silent. Behind Tucker, his men had gone still, hands drifting toward where hands drift when trouble comes, and Tucker held up one hand to hold them easy without turning around. "On what charge?" Tucker said. "Arson," Coombs said, "and murder." He swallowed. "The Delacroix fire. We got a witness, Blackburn. Sworn statement. Says he saw you set it. Saw you right away from the Delacroix place the night it burned." "That's a lie," Flora said, coming down off the porch fast, and Tucker said, "Flora," low and warning, but she didn't stop. "That's a bought lie, Sheriff, and you know it. Who's the witness? Who swore it? I'll bet you my life it's a man who owes Cyrus Vane money." Coombs's face went red. "Ma'am, I'd ask you to stand back." "Who is he? Say his name." I'm not obliged to, because if it's a man in Vane's debt," Flora pressed loud enough for all 6 deputies to hear, "then this whole warrant's rotten, and every man standing here helping serve it is going to be remembered by name when the truth comes out. And it will come out, Sheriff. I've got people riding this whole valley right now gathering it up. Every ranch Vane burned, every note he called early, every lie he told. So you go ahead and arrest my husband on a bought witness's word, and you pray to God you're on the right side of it when the reckoning comes, because I promise you, a reckoning is coming." For a moment nobody moved. The sheriff's hand had gone white on the warrant, and Tucker Blackburn stepped forward calm and put himself between his wife and the guns, the way he'd once stepped between a burning barn and men who'd stolen from him, and he said, "Flora, enough. I'll go." "Tucker, no." "I'll go," he said again, and he turned and looked at her, and his pale eyes were steady and warm and unafraid. "Because if I fight this here in front of my men with guns, then Vane wins. Then I'm the wolf. Then he's got his story. Blackburn resisted arrest. Blackburn's men opened fire, and it's over. But if I go quiet—" His voice dropped just for her. "If I go quiet and stand trial, and you bring your reckoning into that courtroom in the light of day, where the whole town's watching, then we don't just clear my name, Flora. We hang Cyrus Vane with his own rope. You understand he's overplayed his hand. He got greedy. He put it in front of a judge. And a courtroom is the one place in this valley his money can't reach if we do this right." "Tucker." Her voice broke. "What if we can't? What if the reckoning's not ready? They'll hang you. Then you'll have loved me," Tucker Blackburn said quietly. "And I'll have died a man worth loving, which is more than the wolf ever was, and more than I ever thought I'd get." He touched her face once, gentle in front of the sheriff and the deputies, and God and everyone. "Get your father. Get Ada Vernon. Get every soul in this valley Vane ever wronged. And you bring them to my trial, Flora Blackburn. You bring them all, and you give this town back the truth it traded away." He turned and held out his wrist to the sheriff. "I'm ready, Coombs. Let's go." And as they put the irons on him, the whole yard, watching his men frozen and furious, and held back only by his word, Tucker Blackburn turned his head one last time and found his wife's eyes across the dust, and he said, the thing she'd been too afraid to say twice, said it plain and clear and unafraid for all the world to hear. "I love you, Flora. I have since the day you told that drunk you'd bite. Now go win this. I know you can. You're the strongest thing I ever saw." And they rode him away in chains toward Copper Creek, toward the courthouse, toward Cyrus Vane's rigged and waiting trap, and Flora Blackburn stood alone in the yard and watched her husband go. And this time, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not save her tears for later. She let them come. She let them come hard and hot and furious. And then she wiped them dry, and she lifted her chin, and she turned to Elias, who stood white-faced at her shoulder, and Flora Blackburn said, in a voice like tempered steel, "Saddle me a horse. The fastest one you've got. We've got a whole valley to raise, and I don't intend to lose 1 hour of it. Cyrus Vane thinks he's caught himself a wolf." Her eyes blazed. "He's about to find out the wolf had a wife." She rode until the horse was lathered, and her own hands were raw on the reins. And the first ranch she came to was Ada Vernon's. The old woman met her at the gate with a rifle in the crook of her arm, and lowered it the moment she saw who it was. "They took him," Flora said, not bothering with greeting. "Vane got a bought witness to swear Tucker set the Delacroix fire. Arson and murder. They're going to try him, and if I can't stop it, they're going to hang him." Ada Vernon's face went hard as flint. "Get down off that horse before you kill it," she said. "And come inside. If we're going to raise this valley against Cyrus Vane, we're going to need coffee, and we're going to need a list, and we're going to need it by morning, because a man like Vane doesn't leave a rigged trial sitting long enough for the truth to catch up. When's the trial?" 6 days. 6 days. Ada spat into the dust. "Then we don't sleep much. Get in here, girl. You've got sand everybody in town saying at the Blackburn wife who faced down Pruitt. Now let's see if you've got the rest of what it takes." She held the door. "Because facing down a shopkeeper is one thing. Bringing down the richest man in the valley is another animal entire, and it'll try to eat you, and if you flinch even once, he'll win. You understand me?" "I don't flinch," Flora said. "We'll see," said Ada Vernon. "We surely will." They made the list by lamplight, the two of them, and it was longer than Flora had feared and shorter than she'd hoped. Every ranch Vane had taken. Every note called early. The Petersons, the Hallidays, the Cutters. Before Tucker took them in Old Man Meacham, who'd hanged himself in his barn the week the bank foreclosed. And the Delacroix gone east, address unknown. Ada knew them all, every wound in the valley, because she'd lived long enough to watch each one get made. "The trouble," Ada said, tapping the paper, "isn't finding folks Vane wronged. Half the valley's on this list. The trouble is getting one of them brave enough to say so out loud in a courtroom with Vane sitting right there and the sheriff Vane owns holding the door. Fear girl. That's Vane's whole fortune. He doesn't own this valley with money. He owns it with fear. Same as your husband thought he did, only Vane means his." "Then we take the fear away," Flora said. "Easy to say." "No, listen." Flora leaned forward, and the plan was coming to her now, clear and hard. Fear only works when everybody thinks they're alone. Every one of these families, they're afraid because they think they're the only one, because Vane came to each of them in the dark quiet one at a time and made them feel like there was nobody to stand with. But there's a whole list here, Ada. There's dozens. If we can get them all in one room all at once and let them see each other, let them see they're not alone, that it happened to all of them the same way. Her eyes lit. Fear can't survive that. A man's not afraid to speak when there's 40 people behind him who've got the same story. Vane kept them apart. We just have to bring them together. Ada Vernon looked at her a long moment, and slowly the old woman began to smile. "Well," she said, "I'll be. You are your mother's daughter and then some. Elizabeth Newsom set my boy's arm, once you know that, 20 years back. Wouldn't take a cent for it." She stood, joints cracking. "All right, Flora Blackburn. We ride at first light. You take the west of the valley, I take the east. And we don't ask them to testify. Not yet. That scares them off. We just ask them to come to a meeting, one meeting, at the Blackburn Ranch where Vane's men won't come because they're afraid of the wolf, which is about the only time in history that reputation of your husband's is going to do us any good." She grinned, fierce and old. "Let's use the wolf one last time. Then let's kill him for good." The riding took 3 days, and they were the hardest 3 days of Flora's life. Some doors slammed in her face. Some men wouldn't even come out, just shouted through the window that they wanted no part of it, that Vane would ruin what little they had left, that the Blackburn woman should go home before she got them all killed. One woman, the Halliday widow, wept and begged Flora to leave, said her children had nothing left but the roof Vane let them keep, and if she crossed him, they'd lose that too. "I understand," Flora told her gentle at that door. "I do. I'm not asking you to risk your children. I'd never ask that. But Mrs. Halliday..." She looked at the frightened woman. "How long can Vane let you keep that roof?" Do you think a man like that? He took your ranch. He'll take the roof too the day he's done needing you scared. Fear buys you a little time. It never buys you safe. There is no safe under a man like Cyrus Vane. There's only the next thing he takes. She turned to go, then paused. The meeting's Thursday night, at Blackburn Ranch. You don't have to promise anything. You just have to come and see who else is in the room, that's all. Just come and see you're not alone. She didn't think the widow would come. But at other doors, something shifted. At the Peterson place, a hard-eyed man who'd lost 400 acres to a called note listened to Flora's whole speech in stony silence and then said, "Quiet. Vane took my father's land. Land my father broke his back on for 30 years. And the whole town thinks your husband's the devil, while that banker sits in his fine office stealing everything that isn't nailed down." He spat. "I'll come to your meeting, Mrs. Blackburn, and I'll bring my brothers. We've been waiting a long time for somebody with the nerve to stand up first. Reckon it took a woman to do it. Reckon it always does." By the third night, Flora had 11 families who'd said yes, and twice that who'd said maybe, and Ada came back with near as many, and they didn't know if any of them would truly show, because a yes at a man's own gate in daylight was one thing, and riding to the Wolf's ranch in the dark was another. But it was something. It was a start. And when Flora finally fell into her bed in the empty east room alone, aching missing Tucker so bad it was a physical thing, she lay there and stared at the ceiling and thought, "Hold on, you stubborn, foolish man. Hold on. I'm coming. Just hold on." She got to see him once before the trial. The sheriff let her into the jail for 10 minutes, grudging with the deputy standing right there, and Flora walked into that cold cell and found her husband thinner than 3 days ago, unshaved, but with his back straight, and his pale eyes clear, and the sight of him behind those bars nearly broke her in half. "You look terrible," she said, because if she said anything soft, she'd weep. "You look like the finest thing I ever saw," Tucker said. "How's it going? The reckoning? Tell me true." 20-some families. Maybe, if they come. She gripped the bars. "It's a meeting Thursday. If enough of them show, if enough of them see they're not alone, then maybe at the trial. Tucker? I don't know. I don't know if it's enough. Vane's got a witness who'll swear he saw you set the fire and a judge, and the whole town half believing it already, and I've got a room full of scared people who might all lose their nerve the second they see him sitting there." "Who's the witness?" Tucker said. "The one who says he saw me. You find out his name." Coombs finally let it slip. A man named Judd Farrow. And Tucker Blackburn went very still. "Judd Farrow," he repeated. "You know him. I know him." Tucker's voice had changed. "Judd Farrow used to ride for the Delacroix, Emile's man. Worked their place near 10 years. His eyes had gone hard and bright. "Flora, listen to me. This is important. Judd Farrow was on the Delacroix ranch the night it burned. He wasn't riding by. He wasn't a witness who happened to see me. He lived there. He was one of Emile's own hands." Flora's heart began to pound. "So if he's swearing you said it, then either he's lying for Vane's money," Tucker said slowly, "or Flora, or he knows exactly who really set that fire, because he was there when it happened. He was on the property, a hand that loyal 10 years with Emile, and now he turns up swearing against me for the man who ruined the family he served." Tucker shook his head. "That's not a bought stranger, Flora. That's a man who saw something. That's a man Vane's got by the throat somehow. You find out what Vane's holding over Judd Farrow, and you don't have a witness against me anymore. You've got a witness against Vane." "How?" Flora breathed. "How do I find out what Vane's got on him?" "Farrow's got a family, a wife, some kids. They live in town now since the Delacroix place burned in one of Vane's rent houses." Tucker's jaw tightened. A man doesn't swear a lie that hangs an innocent unless somebody's got a knife at something he loves. Find the knife, Flora. Find what Vane's threatening. And find it before Thursday, because once that man testifies under oath, it's 10 times harder to unswear it. He reached through the bars and gripped her hand hard. "Can you do this? It's dangerous. If Vane finds out you're circling Farrow..." "I can do it," Flora said. It's dangerous, Tucker said again. I mean it. Vane's already got men in this town who'd... He stopped. His hand tightened on hers. I don't want you doing this if it puts you in his reach. I'd rather hang than have him touch one hair of your head, you understand me, I mean that. I'd walk to that gallows glad if it kept you clear of him. Then it's a good thing it's not your choice, Flora said, and she leaned her forehead against the cold bars until it touched his. You chose me 2 years ago across a street. Well, I've chosen you now. And choosing means I don't leave you to hang to keep myself safe. That's not what it means, Tucker. That's not what any of this means. So you hold on, and you trust me, and you let me do the thing I'm good at, which is biting. All right? For a long moment, Tucker Blackburn just breathed forehead to forehead with his wife through iron bars. All right, he said finally, rough. God, I love you. Go on. Go find the knife, before I change my mind and beg you to stay safe. She found Judd Farrow's wife 2 days before the trial, and it was the hardest conversation Flora had ever had. The woman's name was Nell, and she was younger than Flora expected, with 3 small children, and eyes that had the hunted look of someone who hadn't slept in weeks. She wouldn't let Flora pass the door at first, wouldn't say a word. But Flora had learned something in 3 days of frightened doors, and she didn't push, didn't argue. Just stood there on the step and said quietly, Mrs. Farrow, I'm not here to make trouble for you. I know your husband's fixing to testify against mine, and I know he served Emile Delacroix 10 years faithful and loved that family. And I can't for the life of me understand why a man like that would swear a lie to help the banker who burned them out. She paused. Unless somebody made him. Unless somebody's got something over your family that scares you worse than lying does. And I think that's what happened. And I think you're just as frightened as I am, and I think we might be frightened of the same man. Nell Farrow's face crumpled. Just for a second. Then she caught it. You have to go, she whispered. If they see you here. Who? If who sees me here? Flora stepped closer, gentle. Mrs. Farrow, what does Cyrus Vane have on you? What did he threaten? Please. My husband is going to hang for a fire he didn't set. And your husband knows it. And I think you know it too, and I think it's eating you both alive. So please. What's the knife? What's he holding over you? And Nell Farrow, 26 years old with 3 babies and no husband's wage since the Delacroix burned, broke down on her own doorstep and told Flora Blackburn the truth. The children, she wept. Our oldest, our boy. He's Vane holds the note on my mother's house, where my mother lives. My mother's dying. Mrs. Blackburn, she's got the wasting sickness. She's got months, maybe. And all she wants is to die in her own bed, in her own house. The house my father built. And Vane came to Judd, and he said if Judd didn't swear what he wanted, he'd put my dying mother out in the road. Turn her out. Let her die in a ditch. She was sobbing now, past caring who heard. And Judd, he didn't want to. He loved Mr. Delacroix. He cried about it. He's not slept. He says he can't live being the man who hangs an innocent. But what could he do? What could we do? They're going to turn my mother out to die if he doesn't. He didn't set the fire, Flora said very quietly, and it wasn't a question. Nell Farrow went still. Your husband was there that night, Flora said. He served the Delacroix. He was on that ranch when it burned. And he knows who really said it, doesn't he? He saw. That's why Vane needs him so bad. Not just to lie about Tucker, but to keep quiet about what he actually saw. She held the weeping woman's eyes. Mrs. Farrow, Judd saw who set that fire, didn't he? And Nell Farrow, trembling, whispered the thing that Cyrus Vane had spent good money and hard threats to keep buried. He saw Vane's men, she breathed. 2 of them, riding away from the Delacroix place with the coal oil still on their hands. Judd saw them clear as day. He'd have gone to the law, but the law's Vane's, and then Vane came and made the threat about my mother, and told Judd he'd best forget what he saw and remember something else instead. Remember seeing the wolf. Remember seeing Blackburn. She wiped her face. So that's the lie. That's the whole lie. My Judd saw Cyrus Vane's own men set that fire, and Vane's making him swear he saw your husband and using my dying mother to do it." Flora stood very still on that doorstep, and inside her, something was blazing up clean and white and terrible. "Mrs. Farrow," she said. "Nell, look at me." The woman looked. "What if your mother didn't have to leave her house?" Flora said. "What if that note was cleared, bought up, gone? What if Cyrus Vane had nothing to hold over you at all, and your Judd could stand up in that courtroom and tell the truth? The real truth, the one that's been eating him alive, the one about the 2 men and the coal oil. What if he could be the man who served Emile Delacroix faithful for 10 years one more time by telling the truth about what happened to him? Would he do it? If the knife was gone, would Judd Farrow tell the truth? Nell Farrow stared at her. "You can't clear that note," she whispered. "It's $400. Nobody's got—" "My husband," Flora said, "owns 20,000 acres and a piece of the very bank that holds your mother's note. And he would sell every acre of it before he'd let a dying woman be turned out into the road to buy a lie. I'll have that note cleared by tomorrow morning, Nell. I'll have it in your hand, paid in full, your mother safe in her bed for as long as God gives her. And in return, all I ask is that your Judd tells the truth. Not a lie for me instead of a lie for Vane. Just the truth. The thing he saw. Will he do it? If I take away the knife, will Judd Farrow do the right thing?" And Nell Farrow put both hands over her face and wept, and this time it was not fear, and she nodded, and she nodded, and she said through her hands, "Yes, yes, God forgive us. Yes, he's been dying to. He's been half a ghost since Vane made him swear it. Yes, he'll tell the truth. Oh, thank God he'll tell the truth." Flora had Elias ride to the bank at dawn with a note in Tucker's own hand, authority Tucker had given her, before they took him, and by noon, the debt on the house of Nell Farrow's dying mother was paid in full and clear, and the knife Cyrus Vane had held at the Farrow family's throat for 6 months was gone. And Cyrus Vane didn't know it yet. That was the thing Flora held on to, riding home in the dark that night, exhausted past, feeling her whole body one long ache. Vane didn't know. He thought he still had his witness. He thought Thursday's trial was already won. He was going to walk into that courtroom certain, arrogant, sure of his bought lie, and he had no idea that the ground had already opened under his feet. The meeting at Blackburn Ranch was Thursday afternoon hours before the trial that evening, and Flora stood on her own porch at dusk and watched the road, and her heart was in her throat, because she did not know if anyone would come. For a long while, no one did. The yard stayed empty. The road stayed bare. And Flora stood there with Ada Vernon beside her, and her father beside her, and Elias and Mrs. Doheny, and all Tucker's hard, silent men. And she felt the terrible, cold certainty creep in that she had failed. That the fear had won that every family had said maybe, and meant no, and that in a few hours her husband would stand trial alone with a room full of empty benches behind him. "They're not coming," she said. "Ada, they're not coming." "Wait," said Ada Vernon. "It's near dark. They're not." "I said wait, girl." And then far off down the road in the last of the light came a single wagon. It was the Peterson brothers, 4 of them, hard-eyed, come to keep their word. And behind their wagon, another. The Hallidays, the widow Flora had never expected to see with her children beside her, and her chin up and her hands shaking on the reins, but her wagon rolling forward all the same. And behind the Hallidays, another wagon, and another. And riders now single men on horseback, and a whole family crowded into a buckboard, and more coming, more and more, a line of them stretching back down the road into the dark, as far as Flora could see, wagon after wagon after wagon. Every one of them a family. Cyrus Vane had wronged and frightened and made to feel alone. All of them coming out of the dark toward the Blackburn Ranch at once, so that each one cresting the hill could see for the first time that they were not alone, had never been alone, were part of a whole valley full of people who had suffered the same and swallowed the same and been afraid the same, and were done being afraid. Flora Blackburn stood on her porch and watched them come, and she could not speak. "Well," said Ada Vernon softly beside her, "I'll be damned. They came." Her old voice was thick. "In 40 years in this valley I never saw the like. You did this, girl. You put out your hand and you pulled a whole valley up off its knees. You did this." "Tucker did it," Flora whispered, watching the wagons roll in. 11 years ago. He built the houses. He took in the boy. He dug the wells and shared the water when the drought came quiet, never asking thanks. Half these people I found out this week. They owe him something. They never told a soul, because they were ashamed to admit they'd taken help from the wolf. He did this. I just told them it was time to say so out loud. They filled the great room of the Blackburn house and the porch and the yard. More people than the house had held in all its lonely years put together, and Flora stood up before them all, with her heart hammering, and told them the plan, and told them what she'd learned about Judd Farrow and the 2 men and the coal oil, and told them that the man they'd all been taught to fear had spent 11 years protecting the very families who'd learned to hate him, and one by one. In that crowded room, people began to stand up and tell their own true stories, the called notes and the burned barns and the whispered threats in the dark, and the room got angrier and braver and more alive with every voice. And by the time full night had fallen, the fear that Cyrus Vane had spent years building in that valley had cracked clean down the middle and would not be put back together again. "They'll try to scare you at the courthouse," Flora told them. "Vane's men'll be there, the sheriff's Vane's. It'll be frightening. But there's too many of us now. That's the whole thing. That's the only thing. A man like Vane rules by making everyone feel alone, and you are not alone. Look around this room. You have never once been alone. You only thought you were. So we walk in there together, all of us. And we fill every bench in that courthouse, and Vane looks up from his fine seat, and he sees the whole valley he thought he'd beaten, sitting there staring back at him, and for the first time in his life, Cyrus Vane is going to know what it feels like to be afraid." She lifted her chin. "Now let's go get my husband back." The courthouse was packed to the walls, and Cyrus Vane, sitting in the front in his fine gray suit, turned to look at the crowd filing in, and Flora watched the smile die on his face by inches. He'd expected empty benches. He'd expected a beaten town, a frightened valley, a formality of a trial. Instead, the whole valley came pouring through those doors, family after family, filling every seat and lining every wall, silent, grim, staring at him. And Flora saw the exact moment Cyrus Vane understood that something had gone very wrong, that the fear he'd banked on had somehow overnight turned into its opposite. Tucker was brought in chains, and when he saw the crowded room, when he saw his whole valley come out for him. Flora watched her husband's iron composure crack, watched him search the benches until he found her, and she nodded to him once and mouthed, "I found the knife," and she saw the understanding light his tired, pale eyes. The judge, a vain man named Harlow, banged his gavel for order and clearly wished he were anywhere else. The charges were read. Arson, murder. And Cyrus Vane's lawyer stood smooth and confident still and called his witness. The prosecution calls Judd Farrow, and Judd Farrow walked to the stand. A haggard, hollow-eyed man, and Flora held her breath, because everything came down to this, to whether a frightened man, with a dying mother-in-law, now safe in her bed, would find the courage to tell the truth in a room full of the powerful man who'd threatened him. Vane's lawyer smiled. "Mr. Farrow, tell the court. On the night the Delacroix ranch burned, did you see the man who set the fire?" Judd Farrow looked at the lawyer. He looked at Cyrus Vane sitting there, confident, certain sure his knife was still at the man's throat. He looked at Tucker Blackburn in his chains. And then Judd Farrow's eyes found the back of the courtroom, found his wife Nell standing there, and Nell nodded to him and mouthed something, and Flora, close enough to see, watched Nell Farrow mouth to her husband mother's safe. "Tell the truth." And Judd Farrow closed his eyes. "I did," he said. Vane's lawyer smiled wider. "And who did you see? Who set the fire that killed—" "I saw 2 men," Judd Farrow said, and his voice was getting stronger now, steadier, a man setting down a weight he'd carried too long. 2 men ride away from the Delacroix place with coal oil still wet on their hands. And I know their names. I've known them 6 months. And I'll say them now under oath, God as my witness, because I served Émile Delacroix 10 years, and I'll not let his memory be dirtied by a lie 1 hour longer. The courtroom had gone dead silent. Mr. Farrow, the lawyer said sharply, the smile gone. You are under oath to answer the question as the 2 men who burned the Delacroix ranch. Judd Farrow said loud and clear, and ringing to the rafters, pointing one shaking hand straight at the front row, were Dale Hutchins and Cy Meeker, and they were paid to do it, by him, by Cyrus Vane. The courtroom exploded. Vane was on his feet, white with fury, shouting his lawyer, shouting the judge, hammering his gavel, and over all of it, Judd Farrow kept talking, kept pouring out the truth he'd been strangling on for 6 months, the whole of it. The coal oil and the 2 men and the threat against his dying mother-in-law and the lie Vane had forced him to swear, and the whole valley was on its feet now roaring, and Flora Blackburn stood in the middle of the storm she had raised and looked at her husband across the churning room. And Tucker Blackburn, still in his chains, was looking back at her, and there were tears standing in the tired, pale eyes of the man they'd called the Wolf of the Valley. And he mouthed to her across the roar, across the crowd, across everything, "You did it. You bit him." "Order!" the judge was bellowing. "Order in this court!" But there was no order, because now the Peterson brothers were on their feet, shouting about their called note, and Ada Vernon was up, telling about the Meacham foreclosure, and the Halliday widow was crying out about her ranch, and one voice after another rose up out of that packed room, every family Cyrus Vane had ruined, every wound he'd made in that valley, all of them speaking at once, all of them refusing to be afraid. 1 minute longer, a whole valley finding its voice in a single hour after years of silence. And Cyrus Vane stood in the middle of it, turning slowly around and around, staring at the faces, understanding at last, far too late, that the thing he'd built his whole fortune on, the fear, the isolation, the certainty that no one would ever dare stand together against him, had just come apart in his hands forever. And Flora Blackburn, who had walked into this valley, a girl sold to pay a debt, who did not cry, who had saved up all her tears. For a day she could spend them, stood in the thundering courtroom and let herself weep at last, freely, openly in front of God and the whole valley, and the husband she had fought, a banker and a rigged trial, and a whole town's fear to save. Because she had found the knife, and she had taken it away, and the man the world had called a monster was going to walk out of that courtroom a free man and come home to the green land and the empty house that would not be empty anymore. And Cyrus Vane was going to learn, at long and terrible last, exactly what it cost to threaten the one thing on this earth that Tucker Blackburn loved. The judge was still hammering his gavel, and it was doing no good at all, and through the roar and the tears and the thunder of a whole valley. Finding its feet, Flora fought her way across the courtroom toward her husband in his chains. And she did not stop until she had reached him, and she took his face in both her hands, and she pressed her forehead to his, and Tucker Blackburn bowed his head down to hers. And in the middle of all that chaos, the 2 of them stood perfectly still. 2 people who had each survived a world that tried to turn them cruel, holding on. They did not let Tucker Blackburn walk free that night. And that was the first thing Flora learned about winning, that winning is never as clean as the moment it happens. Judge Harlow, hammering his useless gavel over the roar, finally shouted the court into a recess. And in the chaos of it, Cyrus Vane's lawyer was on his feet, demanding that Judd Farrow's testimony be struck, screaming that the man was a proven liar who'd already sworn one thing and now swore another, and that a witness who lied under oath once couldn't be trusted to tell the truth now. "He's got a point," Ada Vernon muttered grimly at Flora's side. "That's the danger, girl. Farrow already swore a false statement to the sheriff. Now he swears the opposite. Vane's man'll say he's lying either way, and a jury that's half Vane's might just believe it." "Then we need more than Farrow," Flora said. "We need the 2 men, Hutchins and Meeker, the ones he named. They'll have run by morning. The second Farrow said their names in open court, they're gone. Vane'll have them out of the valley on the fastest horses he owns." And Flora looked across the churning courtroom to where Cyrus Vane stood, and she saw him lean in and murmur something to one of his men, low and fast. And she saw the man nod and slip toward the side door, and she knew in her bones exactly what that order was. "They're running now," she breathed. "Right now. Ada. He's sending word to them right now to run." "Then it's over," Ada said. "Without the two men, it's Pharaoh's word against Vane's and—" "No." Flora was already moving, already shoving through the crowd toward the front, toward the chained figure of her husband. "Elias," she called out. "Elias, where are you?" The young man appeared at her shoulder in an instant. "Here, ma'am." Two men, Dale Hutchins and Cy Meeker. Vane's just sent word for them to run the valley tonight. You know them, you know where they'd be. Elias's face went hard. "I know them. Hutchins drinks at the Longhorn every night of his life. Meeker'll be with him or close." "Then ride," Flora said. "Take every man Tucker's got. Take them all. And you bring me Dale Hutchins and Cy Meeker before they clear the county line, and you do it without firing a shot if you can, because if Blackburn men kill anybody tonight, Vane wins and Tucker hangs. You bring them back breathing Elias, both of them, alive. Can you do that?" Elias was already backing toward the door, his hand at his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "those men helped burn the family that took me in when I was starving. Emile Delacroix gave me my first hot meal before Tucker ever did. I've wanted a reason to lay hands on Dale Hutchins for 6 months." His eyes were flint. "I'll have them back before midnight. Alive. On my life." And he was gone. And half of Tucker's hard, silent men went with him, melting out of the crowded courthouse into the dark, and Flora turned back to the chaos and prayed to a God she wasn't sure listened to women that she'd moved fast enough. They took Tucker back to the cell that night, because the judge would not rule until the recess was done, and Flora was allowed 10 minutes with him before they closed the courthouse, and she used them to tell him everything. "Nell Pharaoh," she said fast, low, gripping the bars. Vane held her dying mother's house note over Judd's head. "Threatened to turn a dying woman out to die in a ditch if Judd didn't swear against you. I cleared the note. Bought it out in your name this morning. That's why Judd told the truth today. The knife's gone." Tucker was staring at her like she'd hung the moon. "You bought a dying woman's house," he said slowly, "to free a man who was going to help hang me. To free a man who was being forced to help hang you," Flora corrected. "There's a difference, remember? You taught me that. Nobody chooses freely with a knife at their throat. Take the knife away and you find out who a person really is. And Judd Pharaoh, it turns out, is a man who served Emile Delacroix 10 years and couldn't live with being the one who dirtied his memory." She pressed closer to the bars. "And now I've sent Elias after Hutchins and Meeker, the two men Judd named. Vane's running them tonight, so I sent every man you've got to bring them back alive before they clear the county." Tucker went very still. "Flora," he said, "if those men run and get clear, then it's Pharaoh's word against Vane's, and Pharaoh already perjured himself once. Vane wins on reasonable doubt." "I know. And if Elias catches them, but there's blood." "I know that too. I told him. Alive both of them, no shots fired." She held his eyes through the iron. "It's the whole thing, Tucker. It all comes down to whether one young man you saved from starving 11 years ago can ride fast enough and keep his temper long enough to bring back the two men who burned the family that fed him before you did. That's what it comes down to. That's the whole reckoning hanging on Elias's temper and a fast horse." Tucker Blackburn was quiet for a long moment. And then unexpectedly, he laughed low and rough and real. "You know what's funny," he said. 11 years I built the wolf. 11 years I kept everybody at arm's length trusted. Nobody did everything my own self because I couldn't afford to need anyone. And now here I am, chained in a cell, and my whole life hangs on other people. On Judd Pharaoh's conscience. On Nell Pharaoh's word. On Elias's temper. On a valley full of families I thought hated me showing up to fill a courtroom." He shook his head slowly, wonderingly. "You did that. You took the man who trusted nobody, and you tangled him up in a whole valley's worth of people till his life depends on all of them. And the strange thing, Flora, The thing I can't get over." His voice caught. "I'm not afraid. I should be terrified. My life's in a dozen other hands, and I can't control one bit of it. And I'm not afraid because for the first time in 11 years I trust the hands it's in. You gave me that. Whatever happens tonight, you gave me that." And Flora Blackburn reached through the bars and took her husband's face in her hands, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. And they stayed like that until the deputy came and made her go. Elias brought them back at 11 o'clock. Flora was waiting at the courthouse steps in the dark, wrapped in a shawl against the cold. Her father beside her, and Ada beside her, and Nell Farrow, who would not go home, standing pale and silent nearby, when she heard the horses coming hard down the main street of Copper Creek, and she stood up, her heart in her mouth. They came into the light of the courthouse lamps, Tucker's men on their lathered horses, and in the middle of them, hands-bound faces sullen and frightened, rode two men. "Dale Hutchins," Elias said, swinging down, breathing hard, a bruise coming up on his jaw, but his eyes bright and hard and triumphant. "And Cy Meeker. Caught them saddling up at the Longhorn with their bags packed, ma'am, running just like you said. Hutchins swung on me. That's this." He touched the bruise, grinning. "But you said alive and no shots, and there's not a shot been fired, and here they are, both of them, breathing." Flora looked at the two men, at Dale Hutchins, with his split lip, and his hating eyes at Cy Meeker, who wouldn't look at anyone at all, who sat his horse with his shoulders hunched, like a man who'd been waiting 6 months for this, and was almost relieved it had come. "Meeker," she said quietly, and the younger of the two flinched. "That's your name, Cy Meeker." He nodded, miserable. "You've got a young look to you," Flora said. "Younger than Hutchins there, and you can't hardly keep your eyes up. You've been carrying this a long time, haven't you? Since the spring. Since the night you rode away from the Delacroix place with the coal oil on your hands and 3 lives on your conscience." She stepped closer to his horse. "How old are you, Cy Meeker?" 19, he whispered. 19. Flora nodded slowly. "You know what happens now, don't you? In the morning, you and Hutchins both go before that judge, and Vane's going to hang you for it. Not himself. He'll let you two swing for the fire and walk away clean, same as he was going to let my husband swing. That's what men like Vane do, Cy. They hire the young and the desperate to do the burning, and then they let them hang for it, and they keep their own fine hands clean. You're going to die for Cyrus Vane's crime, and Cyrus Vane's going to be at his breakfast table when they do it." She let that sit. "Unless," Meeker's head came up. "Unless what?" he breathed. "Cy, don't you say a damn word," Hutchins snarled beside him. "You keep your mouth shut, boy, or Vane'll—" "Vane'll what?" Flora said, rounding on Hutchins, sharp as a slap. "Vane'll hang you. He's already hanging you, you fool. You think there's a version of tomorrow where Cyrus Vane saves you. You burned a family for him. You're the only thing tying him to it. Men like Vane don't save the men who can hang them, they bury them. You're already dead, Dale Hutchins. The only question left is whether you die protecting the man who's going to let you swing, or whether you die having finally told the truth about him." She turned back to Meeker, and her voice gentled. "It's the same choice you had, Cy. The same one Judd Farrow had. The same one my husband had 11 years ago when he built himself into a monster to survive. The world puts a knife to your throat and tells you the only way to live is to do the cruel thing. And most people believe it. Most people do the cruel thing and call it survival." She held the boy's eyes. "But it's a lie, Cy. It's always been a lie. There's another choice. There's always another choice. You just have to be brave enough to pay what it costs." And Cy Meeker, 19 years old with 3 lives on his conscience and 6 months of not sleeping in his face, began to cry. "He said he'd kill my sister." Meeker sobbed. "Vane. He said if I didn't do the Delacroix job, she's all I got, mister, she's all I got in the world." And Vane said, "And I did it. I did it. I threw the oil, and I lit it, and I've heard those people screaming every night since I hear them, when I close my eyes. I can't—" He was shaking now, the whole story pouring out of him. "I'll tell it. I'll tell all of it. The judge tomorrow, I'll tell every bit of it, what Vane paid us and what he threatened, and how it was his idea start to finish. I don't care if I hang. I'd rather hang telling the truth than live one more night hearing them scream, I'll tell it, oh God, I'll tell it. And beside him, Dale Hutchins sagged in his saddle, and the fight went out of him all at once, and he said, dull and beaten, Then I'll tell it too. Damn you, boy. Damn all of it. He looked at Flora with his split lip and his hating eyes, and the hate had gone out of them now, leaving just an old, bone-deep exhaustion. You're right about one thing, Mrs. Vane was going to let us swing. I've known it a while, just didn't have the sand to say so till the boy did. He spat blood into the dirt. Fine, tomorrow. We'll tell the judge the whole of it, and I hope to God it's enough to hang that banker, because if we're going down, I want that smiling son of a bitch going down ahead of us. Flora Blackburn stood in the lamplit street and felt the last piece of the reckoning slide into place, and she closed her eyes and breathed out long and slow, and it felt like setting down a weight she'd carried her whole life. 2 men, not one. 2 men who'd struck the match, both of them ready to swear it was Vane's crime, and Judd Farrow, who'd seen them right away, and Nell Farrow, who'd witnessed Vane's threat, and a whole valley full of families ready to testify to every other cruelty the man had done. It wasn't one witness's word against a rich man anymore. It was an avalanche, and there wasn't money enough in Cyrus Vane's bank to stop an avalanche. Lock them up, she told Elias softly. Careful, safe. Guard them yourselves, our men, all night, because Vane's going to try to reach them before morning one way or another. He'll try to buy them, and if he can't buy them, he'll try to silence them. Don't you let anyone near these 2 men until they're standing in front of that judge. They're worth more than gold now. They're worth Tucker's life. Cyrus Vane came for them at 3 in the morning. Flora had known he would. She'd stationed the men herself, 6 of Tucker's hardest, around the little jail where Hutchins and Meeker were held, and she'd stayed awake in the courthouse with Ada and her father and Nell, unable to sleep, waiting because a man like Vane did not simply accept an avalanche coming down on him. A man like Vane fought and fought dirty right up until the last second the fighting could do any good. It was Elias who woke her, shaking her shoulder, his voice low and urgent. Mrs. Blackburn, Vane's men, 4 of them coming up on the jail from the back. They're carrying oil. Flora was on her feet at once, ice in her veins. Oil. Same as the Delacroix, Elias said grimly. He means to burn it. Burn the jail with Hutchins and Meeker inside. No witnesses, no testimony, and he'll say the wolf did it. Say Blackburn's men set the fire to silence the men who could clear him. He turns his own crime into more proof against your husband. Elias's jaw was tight. It's clever, ma'am. If it works, it doesn't just kill the witnesses. It hangs Tucker for certain. Then it doesn't work, Flora said. Wake everyone. Quiet. And Elias. She caught his arm. The same rule. Alive. No shots if we can help it. Because if we can take Vane's own men in the act red-handed with the oil still in their hands coming to burn a jail full of witnesses, then we don't just stop him. We've got him. Caught doing the exact thing he did to the Delacroix. Do you understand? Don't kill them. Catch them. Catch them doing it. And so it was that when Cyrus Vane's 4 men crept up on the little Copper Creek jail in the black hour before dawn with cans of coal oil in their hands, meaning to burn 3 men alive to protect one rich man's secret, they found not a sleeping jail, but a whole crowd of the valley's people waiting silent in the dark. Tucker's men and the Peterson brothers and half a dozen others, and they were taken before they could strike a single match, wrestled to the ground with the oil cans still in their fists, and not one shot was fired, and not one of them got away to warn Vane that the trap he'd set had closed on his own hand instead. And in the morning, when Cyrus Vane walked into that courtroom expecting to hear that the jail had burned in the night, expecting to stand and gravely accuse the Blackburn faction of murdering the witnesses, he instead found the jail standing, and Hutchins and Meeker alive and waiting to testify, and his own 4 men in irons beside them, ready to swear that Cyrus Vane had sent them in the night to burn a jail full of people. Flora watched his face when he understood. She would remember it the rest of her life. She watched Cyrus Vane, the man who had ruled a whole valley by fear, who had ruined her father and burned the Delacroix, and held a dying woman's home hostage, and tried to hang an innocent man. She watched him walk into that courtroom, certain of victory, and understand in the space of about 3 seconds that he had lost everything, that the avalanche had come, that there was no bottom to it, and no stopping it, and no amount of money on this earth that could buy his way out from under it. And she watched him break, not all at once. Men like Vane don't break all at once. First he blustered. First his lawyer shouted about conspiracy, about the Blackburn woman coercing witnesses, about lies stacked on lies. But then Cy Meeker took the stand, 19 years old, and wrecked with grief, and told the whole valley, in a shaking voice, how Cyrus Vane had threatened to kill his sister and paid him to burn the Delacroix family alive, and there wasn't a soul in that packed courtroom who could hear that broken boy and think he was lying. And then Dale Hutchins told it cold and flat, and damning every detail, dates and payments and Vane's own words. And then Judd Farrow told again what he'd seen. And then Nell Farrow told about the threat to her mother. And then the 4 men caught with the oil cans told about being sent to burn the jail in the night. And then one after another, the families of the valley stood and told everything Cyrus Vane had ever done to them. An entire courtroom full of testimony, a whole valley emptying out years of swallowed fear all at once, and it went on for hours, and there was nothing. Nothing Cyrus Vane's money, or his lawyer, or his own sheriff could do to stop the flood. By noon, even Judge Harlow Vane's own man could not pretend anymore. The evidence was too much, the crowd too large, the truth too plain, and a judge who'd sold himself to Cyrus Vane looked out over a courtroom that would never again fear the man, and understood that the safest thing he could do for his own neck was to rule honestly at long last for once in his crooked life. He dismissed all charges against Tucker Blackburn, and he ordered Cyrus Vane arrested then and there for arson for murder, for conspiracy, for the attempted burning of the jail held over for a trial of his own, before a judge from another county who could not be bought. The courtroom did not roar this time. It had roared itself out. Instead, a strange, enormous, trembling quiet fell over the packed room as the deputies, the same deputies who had served Vane for years, came forward under the eyes of the whole watching valley, and put the irons on Cyrus Vane's wrists. And Flora understood that they did it because they were more afraid now of the valley than of the banker, that the fear had flipped entire, that a whole town had remembered all at once that it was bigger than any one man, and always had been. They struck the chains off Tucker Blackburn at the same moment they locked them onto Cyrus Vane, and Flora Blackburn watched her husband stand up free in the middle of that silent courtroom and rub his unshackled wrists and look around at the whole valley that had come out for him. Family after family, all the people he'd spent 11 years believing hated him, all the people he'd quietly protected and helped and sheltered, and never once let himself hope might love him back, and she watched the truth of it land on him. That they had come, that they had filled this room, that they had faced down Cyrus Vane for his sake, and she watched. The wolf of the valley put one weathered hand over his own mouth, and she watched him weep. He didn't try to hide it. That was the thing that undid her. 11 years of iron control, 11 years of giving the world nothing, and Tucker Blackburn stood free in that courtroom and let the whole valley see him cry. And there was no shame in it. Only a man who had been alone for a very long time, discovering all at once in front of everyone that he wasn't anymore. Flora went to him. She didn't run. She walked steady through the parting crowd, and she came to her husband, and she took both his hands in hers, and Tucker looked down at her with the tears running unashamed into the stubble of his jaw, and he said so quiet only she could hear it, "They came. Flora. They all came. For me. They came for the man who dug the wells," Flora said softly. "The man who built the houses. The man who took in a starving boy and made him a foreman. They came for the real Tucker Blackburn, the one you spent 11 years hiding behind the wolf." She squeezed his hands. "The wolf's dead, Tucker. You don't need him anymore. Look around this room. You never needed him half as much as you thought. These people would have stood with you years ago if you'd only let them see who you really were." "I couldn't," Tucker said hoarsely. "I didn't know how. I forgot how to let anyone see me." Till you. Well, Flora said, and her own eyes were streaming now, you'd best remember how, because I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you never forget again. And in the middle of that courtroom in front of the judge, and the deputies, and the whole watching valley in front of her father, who was weeping openly, and Ada Vernon, who was smiling like a girl, and Nell Farrow, whose mother would die safe in her own bed, and Elias with his bruised jaw, and Cy Meeker, who would face his own reckoning, but would face it having told the truth in front of all of them. Tucker. Blackburn pulled his wife into his arms and kissed her, and the valley that had come out of the dark to save him rose up around them and cheered until the courthouse windows rang. They rode home to Blackburn Ranch that evening as the sun went down. The two of them alone at last in the wagon, and for a long while neither of them spoke, because some things are too big for talking and can only be held in silence between two people who understand. But somewhere on that green land, Tucker had fought the whole dying world to keep Flora finally broke the quiet. The poi. Tucker, she said. There's something I have to ask you. Something I've wondered since near my first week in your house. And I think now today of all days, I've finally got the courage to ask it. He glanced at her. Ask. The east room, Flora said gently. My room. The big one with the window on the mountains. Mrs. Doheny told me you built this whole house around that room. Built it for somebody. And that no one ever slept in it. Not one soul in all the years until me, my first hour here. She watched his face. And I found a cradle, Tucker, in the closet at the end of the hall, hand-carved, beautiful, never used. Her voice softened as far as it would go. Who was she, Tucker? Who did you build that room for? Who was the cradle meant to hold? For a long moment, Tucker Blackburn drove in silence, and Flora thought maybe she'd asked too much. Maybe today of all days was too much, and she was opening her mouth to take it back when he finally spoke. Her name was Cora, he said quietly. We were young, before the wolf, before any of it. She was going to be my wife. He kept his eyes on the road, but his voice was steady, the steady of a wound long healed over, rather than a wound still open. I built this house for her. Every board of it. The east room was to be ours, hers, and mine. And I made it the biggest, and put the mountains in the window, because she loved the mountains. And the cradle. A small breath. I carved the cradle myself nights in secret, because she'd told me she was carrying our child. Flora's throat closed. Tucker. There was a sickness came through the valley, Tucker said. The winter before we were to wed. Took a lot of folks. Took Cora. Took the child with her unborn. He was quiet a moment. And I finished the house anyway. Don't ask me why. I finished every board of it, and I built it just like we'd planned the big room, the mountains in the window, and then I shut the door on it, and I never let a living soul set foot inside, because it was hers, and she never got to have it, and it felt like the only thing I could give her was to keep it empty and waiting the way she'd left it. He shook his head slowly. That was the beginning of the wolf, I reckon, if you want to know. That's when I stopped letting the world in. I'd loved something soft, and the world had taken it same as it always does, and I decided I'd never again be soft enough to lose that way. So I built the walls, both kinds, the ranch and the reputation, and I kept that one room empty as a kind of, I don't know, a grave, maybe. A grave for the life I didn't get to have. Flora sat very still beside her husband, and her heart was breaking and mending both at once. And then you gave it to me, she whispered. My first hour. The room you kept empty for 11 years like a grave. You gave it to me. Tucker pulled the wagon to a stop. He turned to look at her, and the last of the sunset was on his weathered face, and his tired pale eyes were clear and unafraid. Because you were the first soft thing I'd let myself want since Cora, he said simply. The girl who stepped in front of the drunk. I'd built 11 years of wall to keep from ever wanting anything I could lose. And then I saw you, and I wanted, and it scared me worse than anything had scared me since the sickness. And when your father's note came due, I told myself all kinds of practical lies about why I was clearing it. But the truth, Flora, the truth I couldn't even say to myself until just now. His voice caught. The truth is, I gave you Cora's room because some part of me knew from that very first hour that you were the one who was finally going to make me take the wall down. That you were going to be the life I got to have after all. And I couldn't keep that room a grave anymore once you walked into my house. Because you weren't a ghost. You were alive. And you made me want to be alive too. And Flora Blackburn, who did not cry, who had once saved up all her tears for a day. She could spend them and had lately been spending them freely. Reached across the wagon seat and pulled her husband to her, and held him. Held the wolf of the valley, who was not a wolf at all, and had never been held. The boy who'd carved a cradle in secret and lost everything, and built himself a fortress of fear to keep from ever being hurt again. And she pressed her lips to his rough cheek, and she said fierce and low and certain, "Then the grave's closed. Tucker Blackburn, you hear me? It's closed for good. That room's not for the dead anymore. It's ours. It's for the living. It's for whatever comes next." She drew back and looked him in the eyes. "And I promise you on my mother's grave, and my own life, that whatever comes next, we face it together out loud. No walls, no wolf, no more grieving alone in shut rooms. Together, you and me, everything from here on out, together. Say you understand me." Tucker Blackburn looked at his wife in the last red light on the green land he'd nearly lost, and had won back only because she refused to let him lose it. And something in his weathered face, that had been clenched shut for 11 long years, finally fully opened. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Together. I understand you." He touched her face. "You've made me understand a great many things I'd given up on ever understanding again, and I mean to spend the rest of my days trying to be worth even one of them." And he took up the reins, and he drove them the last stretch home to the great house that had stood empty and waiting through 11 lonely years, and would not stand empty one day longer. The first change came slow, the way real change always does, and Flora almost missed it, because she was watching for something bigger. It was the door of the East Room. For 11 years, it had been kept shut. And one morning, a week after the trial, Flora came up the stairs to find Tucker standing in front of it. Just standing, his hand flat against the wood, not going in, not walking away. And she stopped on the landing and watched him. And she understood he was saying goodbye to something. "Tucker," she said gently. He didn't turn. "I keep thinking I ought to feel like I'm betraying her," he said. "Cora, every time I'm happy now, every time you make me laugh, I keep waiting to feel like I'm forgetting her, and it's a sin, and I ought to be ashamed." He finally turned to look at Flora. "But I don't feel that. I feel like she'd have liked you. That's the strange thing. I feel like Cora would have looked at you facing down Cyrus Vane and said, 'That one Tucker. That's the one. Don't you dare let her get away.'" His voice was rough. "Is that foolishness to think the dead would want us happy?" "No," Flora said, and she came to stand beside him, and she put her hand over his where it rested on the door. "I think that's the least foolish thing you've ever said. My mother would have loved you too, you know. She'd have set your men's broken bones and fed you till you couldn't move, and told you that you think too much. She'd have taken one look at this whole sad empty house and rolled up her sleeves." Flora smiled. "The dead don't want us to grieve forever, Tucker. That's the living's mistake. We think love means never setting the grief down. But the ones who loved us real love, they'd give anything to see us happy again. Cora wants you happy. My mother wants me happy. That's what love is in the end. It wants the other one to live." Tucker Blackburn was quiet a long moment. Then he pushed the door open all the way, and morning light spilled out into the hall, and he stood looking into the room he'd kept as a grave for 11 years. "Then let's make it a nursery," he said quietly. "When the time comes, Cora's room. Let's fill it with a living child instead of an empty cradle. I think—" His voice caught. "I think that's the only way to honor her that isn't just more grief, to let the room finally hold what it was always meant to hold." And Flora, standing beside him in the flood of morning light, felt her breath catch, because there was something she'd suspected for near 2 weeks now, and hadn't yet found the moment to say, and here of all moments was the moment finding her. "Tucker," she said carefully, "when you say when the time comes, I mean, whenever God—" He stopped. He looked at her, something in her face. Flora. I wasn't certain, she said. I wanted to be certain before I said anything, because I know what that cradle means to you, and I couldn't bear to give you hope. And then, but Mrs. Doheny, she's borne children. She knows the signs, and she's been watching me a week, and this morning she took my hands, and she said— Flora's voice was shaking now. Tucker, I think the time's already come. I think there's going to be a living child in Cora's room a good deal sooner than either of us planned. For a moment, Tucker Blackburn did not move at all. He stood in the doorway of the room he'd built for a life he thought he'd lost forever. And he looked at his wife, and Flora watched the words reach him, watched them go all the way down. You're— He couldn't say it. Flora, you're telling me you're— I'm telling you, she said, and she was crying and laughing both at once, that the wolf of the valley is going to be a father, and that you'd best sit down because you've gone the color of a bedsheet, and I did not survive Cyrus Vane just to have my husband faint in a doorway. And Tucker Blackburn did not faint. He crossed the doorway in one step and gathered his wife up off her feet, careful, so careful, like she'd become the most fragile and precious thing in all of creation, which to him she had, and he pressed his face into her hair, and Flora felt him shaking, this hard, silent man, shaking clear through, and she felt the wet of his tears in her hair, and he said her name over and over, like it was the only word he knew, and then he said muffled and broken, and full of a wonder, 11 years of grief had never once let him feel. A child. We're going to have a child. In her room. In the room that was always meant for oh Flora. Flora, I never thought. I gave up on ever. And you walked into my life, and you gave me back everything the world took. My name, my people, my valley. And now— He drew back to look at her, and his weathered face was wet and open and young, younger than she'd ever seen it, the boy underneath the wolf finally fully free. And now a child. I don't deserve it. I don't deserve any of it. But God help me, Flora. I'm going to spend every day of my life trying to. You do deserve it, Flora said, fiercely holding his face. That's the thing you've never understood, Tucker Blackburn, and I'm going to spend our whole lives making you believe it. You always deserved it. The wolf was never the truth of you. The truth of you is a man who carves cradles in secret and builds houses for his workers and takes in starving boys and digs wells to save a valley that hates him. That's who you are. That's who our child's going to have for a father. And that child is the luckiest child in the whole state of Colorado, and I will fight anyone who says different, same as I fought for you. The whole valley heard by week's end, because good news travels faster than fear ever did. And Flora learned that a valley freed from a tyrant's grip becomes something she'd never imagined a place could be. Neighbors who'd hidden behind their doors for years came out into the light. The families Cyrus Vane had ruined began slowly to be made whole. That part was Tucker's doing, and it was the second great change, and it happened at a table. He called a meeting weeks after the trial at the ranch, the same great room that had filled with frightened families in the dark, and now filled again in daylight with people who came unafraid. And Flora watched her husband stand up before them, all the man who for 11 years had spoken to almost no one, and clear his throat, and struggle for the words, because he had spent so long in silence that speaking plain to a room full of people cost him something visible. You all know what Vane did, Tucker said. Called your notes early, burned folks out, bought your land for pennies when he'd ruined you, took what your fathers and your grandfathers broke their backs to build. He paused. The bank held most of those notes, and I own a piece of that bank. Bought it years back to have a hand near Vane to watch him. His jaw worked. Which means a piece of what he stole I profited from whether I meant to or not. And I can't live with that. So here's what's going to happen. And Tucker Blackburn told a room full of ruined families that he was giving it back. All of it. The Peterson land, the Halliday Ranch, the Meacham place. Every acre Cyrus Vane had stolen through the bank, Tucker would use his share and his own money to buy back out of the bank's hands, and return free and clear to the families it had been taken from. Not sold back, not loaned, returned, given. The room went dead silent. That's Old Peterson was on his feet, his hard face working. "Blackburn, that's a fortune. That's more money than any man you can't just give away." "I can," Tucker said, "and I am. I spent 11 years hoarding and walling off and keeping everyone at arm's length, and it near cost me my life, and it did cost me 11 years I'll never get back. I'm done hoarding. Water's meant to be shared, land's meant to be worked by the folks who love it, and a man's meant to live in a valley, not lord over one." He looked around the room. "I was the wolf a long time. I'm done being the wolf. I'd rather be a neighbor, if you'll have me." And Flora watched a whole room full of hard Western people, people who did not weep easily, people the world had beaten and frightened and ground down. She watched them come apart, watched old Peterson cross that room and grip Tucker's hand and not let go, watched the Halliday widow press her apron to her face, watched grown men who'd feared her husband for a decade line up to shake his hand and call him neighbor. And she stood at the back of the room with her hand on her belly where their child was growing. And she thought her heart might break clean open with the fullness of it. Her father came to her there at the back and stood beside her, and for a while the two of them just watched. "Your mother," Harlan Newsom said finally thick, "used to say that a person's true self is the one that comes out when the fear falls away. That everybody's got a frightened self and a true self, and most folks live and die never letting the world see which is which." He shook his head slowly, watching Tucker Blackburn give away a fortune to the people he'd once let believe he was a monster. "I sold you to that man Flora, to save my own skin and my own land. It was the worst thing I ever did. And it turned out to be—" His voice broke. "It turned out to be the thing that saved us all. Not because of me, in spite of me. Because you walked into that man's house and you weren't afraid and you pulled the true self out of him, and it turned out to be the finest man in this whole valley." He looked at his daughter. "Can you forgive me, girl? I don't ask it lightly. I know what I did. But can you? Someday. Can you forgive your old fool of a father?" And Flora looked at her father, at the broken, repentant man who had sold her and then ridden the whole valley to help her save the man he'd sold her to. And she found that the anger she'd carried, the hard, cold thing she'd nursed since that day in the kitchen, had somewhere along the way gone quiet. "I forgave you a while back, Pa," she said. "The day you rode out to help me, when you could have just brought me home safe and let Tucker hang, and instead you got on a horse and rode to every ranch in the valley for me. That's when I forgave you." She took his weathered hand. "You did a terrible thing out of fear, and then you did a brave thing out of love. And the second one's the truer one, just like Mama said. So yes, Pa, you're forgiven. You've been forgiven for weeks. I was only waiting for you to be brave enough to ask." And Harlan Newsom put his arms around his daughter and wept into her hair. And the reconciliation her mother would have prayed for came at last in the back of a crowded room on the day the wolf of the valley gave away his fortune and became a neighbor. The child came in the spring. It was not an easy birth. Flora would not pretend later that it was. There was a long, hard night, the longest of Tucker Blackburn's life. A night he would tell his son about years later. A night he spent wearing a track in the floorboards outside a door he was not allowed through. A night when the whole valley's newfound love for him meant nothing at all against the terror of the woman he loved, crying out behind a closed door, "She's strong." Mrs. Doheny told him, coming out once briefly, wiping her hands. "Strongest I ever birthed." "But it's hard, Tucker. I'll not lie to you. It's hard and it's slow, and you'd best pray." And Tucker Blackburn, who had built an empire and faced down rustlers and survived a rigged trial and stared down death without flinching, sank to his knees in the hallway, outside that door, and prayed like a child prayed to a god. He'd stopped speaking to. The winter Cora died, and Flora, in the worst of it, heard him through the door. Heard the low, broken murmur of her husband begging heaven not to take this from him too. Not again. Not her. Not after everything. And it steadied her. That was the thing she'd tell him after, hearing him pray, hearing the fear in the voice of the man she'd never once seen afraid. It made her furious enough to survive out of pure spite, because she would be damned before she'd leave Tucker Blackburn alone in a house of graves a second time. You hear me, Tucker Blackburn? She gasped at the worst of it, loud enough to carry through the door. I did not survive Cyrus Vane to die in my own bed. Do you hear me? I'm not going anywhere. We do everything together now, remember? You promised me. Together. And I'm not doing this dying business without you, so you can just stop that praying like I'm already gone. And behind the door, she heard her husband laugh a wet, broken laugh through his tears and call back, Yes, ma'am, together. Now you get on with it, woman. I've been out here going gray. And near dawn, the child came. A son. Whole and squalling and furious at the world with a fine set of lungs, and Mrs. Doheny swore his father's exact scowl. They let Tucker in, and Flora watched from the bed, exhausted past speaking, as they put his son into his arms, and she watched the wolf of the valley look down at the small, red, furious face of his living child, in the room he'd built for a life he thought he'd lost. And she watched every hard year fall off her husband. All at once, watched 11 years of grief and armor and silence simply dissolve, and Tucker Blackburn sank down onto the edge of the bed with his son in his arms and could not speak at all, could only look and look and look like a man who'd wandered a desert his whole life and been handed water. What'll we call him? Flora whispered. Tucker was quiet a long moment, gazing at his son. I had a thought, he said low. If you'd allow it. There was a man years back. Only man in this valley who never once believed the stories about me. Told me a man who builds houses doesn't burn them down. Called me friend when nobody else would. Vane ruined him for it, burned him out, drove him from the valley. Tucker's throat worked. Émile Delacroix. He had a first name folks never used, an American name his French father gave him to fit the country. Harrison. He looked at Flora. I got word last month. The Delacroix are coming home. I bought back their land, same as all the others, and I wrote and told them it was waiting free and clear, and they're coming back to the valley this summer. And I thought if you'd allow it, I'd like our son to carry the name of the one man who saw the truth of me when the whole world called me a monster. Harrison. Harrison Blackburn. His voice broke. So the boy grows up knowing that being seen true by even one soul is worth more than all the fear in the world. And Flora Blackburn looked at her husband and her son and could not speak for the tears, so she only nodded and reached out and laid her hand over both of theirs, the three of them together in the room that was no longer a grave, and that was how Harrison Blackburn got his name. The years went by, and they were good years, and Flora would come to understand that this was the rarest thing of all, that most stories end at the wedding or the rescue, and never show what came after the long, ordinary golden after. Because the after is the hardest thing to earn and the sweetest thing to keep. The valley healed. The families whose land Tucker returned prospered, and their prospering lifted the whole country, and Copper Creek, which had lived so long under the shadow of one man's fear, became a place where neighbors helped neighbors, and doors stayed unlocked, and children ran barefoot between ranches that no longer eyed each other with suspicion. Cyrus Vane was tried before a judge from another county who could not be bought, and the whole valley testified, and he was sentenced to a prison a long way off. And he was never once mentioned again in that valley, except as a lesson to children about what fear does to a man who chooses it. Judd and Nell Farrow's mother died that autumn, peaceful in her own bed in her own house with her family around her, and Judd Farrow came to Blackburn Ranch after, and stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and could not find the words. And Tucker Blackburn, who understood better than most what it was to be unable to speak, only gripped the man's shoulder and said, "You told the truth when it cost you everything to tell it. That's a rare thing, Judd." Émile would have been proud. "Come work my North Range. Elias could use a man he can trust." And Judd Farrow wept, and came, and the two men who'd each nearly been destroyed by Cyrus Vane's fire worked that green land side by side for the rest of their lives. Cy Meeker faced his reckoning as he'd said he would, and it was a hard one because 3 people had died, and the law is the law. But the judge, hearing how Vane had threatened the boy's sister, hearing how the boy had told the whole truth freely, when he could have run, hearing Tucker Blackburn himself stand up and speak for mercy for the young man who'd once helped burn his friend, gave Cy Meeker a sentence of years rather than a rope. And when Cy Meeker walked out of that prison, a grown man with gray already in his hair, it was Tucker Blackburn's hand that was waiting to shake his. And Tucker Blackburn's ranch that gave him honest work, because Tucker understood better than any man alive that the world puts knives to people's throats and calls the cruelty they do survival. And that a man who finally chooses the truth deserves the chance to become who he might have been. "You give everyone a second chance," Flora said to him once, watching him hire yet another of the valley's broken and desperate. "Elias, Judd, Cy Meeker, half your hands are men the world threw away." "So was I," Tucker said simply. "The world threw me away too, Flora, called me a monster and left me to be one. You're the only person who ever looked at a thing the world had thrown away and saw what it might still be." He put his arm around her. "I'm just doing what my wife taught me, looking for the true self under the frightened one. Turns out there's a great deal worth saving if you take away the knife and give a person the chance to choose." Harrison grew, and he grew up nothing like the wolf his father had once pretended to be, because he never knew that man. He knew only the Tucker Blackburn who read to him at night and taught him to ride and carried him on his shoulders through the green pastures the way Harlan Newsom had once carried Flora, telling his son he was worth more than the whole state of Colorado. He knew a father who was slow to anger and quick to help and honest to a fault. He grew up in a house that had once stood empty as a grave and now rang from morning to night with the noise of a living family, and he never once in his whole boyhood heard anyone in Copper Creek call his father anything but a good man and a fine neighbor, because the fear had died the day the valley found its voice, and it never came back. There were more children, a daughter whom they named Elizabeth for Flora's mother, and another son. The great house filled up entirely, at last filled with the life it had been built for and denied for so long, and Cora's room, which had held a grave, held instead a nursery, and then a child's room. And then in time, the laughing tumble of a whole brood of Blackburn children who never knew it had ever been a sad room at all, because the love that filled it had scoured every trace of grief clean away. And Harlan Newsom, forgiven, grew old in the guest room of the ranch, doted on by grandchildren, and died at last in his sleep with his daughter's hand in his, and his last words to her were, "I did one thing right, girl. In the end, I gave you to the finest man in the valley, even if I did it for all the wrong reasons." And Flora held his hand and told him he'd done a great many things right, and that she loved him, and that her mother was waiting. And Harlan Newsom went easy, which is more than a man who sold his daughter had any right to expect, and got only because that daughter had a heart big enough to forgive. One evening, when Harrison was near grown tall, as his father now, Flora found Tucker on the porch of the great house watching the sun go down over the green land, and she came and sat beside him, and the two of them sat in the comfortable silence of two people who had spent a lifetime learning each other. And it was nothing at all like the terrible silence they'd started their marriage inside of, that first cold silence of a captive and her captor. It was the other kind. The kind that comes only after decades of saying everything that needs saying, until at last there's nothing left but peace. "You know what I was thinking?" Tucker said. "Tell me." "I was thinking about the barn," he said. "Our wedding day. You threw the ring at my boots and told me not to pretend it was a marriage." He smiled the deep, easy smile she'd spent a lifetime coaxing out of the man who'd once given the world nothing. "I picked it up, and I told you what you were to me wasn't decided yet, that the part that mattered was still yours to give." He took her hand, weathered now, both of them marked by all their years. "I've been thinking about how long you made me wait to find out what you'd decided, and how it was worth every day of the waiting, every single one." "I was terrified of you," Flora said softly. "That first day, I truly believed I'd been sold to a monster." "You had every reason to." "No," she said. "That's the thing, Tucker. That's the thing I understand now looking back that I couldn't understand then." She turned to him, and her eyes were clear and certain. "The greatest fear of my whole life was you, the wolf of the valley, the monster my father sold me to. I lay awake nights terrified of you." She squeezed his hand. "And it was a lie, all of it. Every bit of the fear was built on lies, the town's lies and Vane's lies, and the lies you told about yourself to keep yourself safe. The most frightening thing in my whole world turned out to be the gentlest man I ever knew, hiding behind a story he'd let a frightened town tell about him. The fear was never you, Tucker. It was never once you. It was only the world's lies about you. She leaned her head against his shoulder. And I've spent a whole beautiful life, glad, so glad that I was brave enough to walk through the fear and find out the truth on the other side. Tucker Blackburn put his arm around his wife and drew her close, and they watched the sun go down together over the valley they had saved, over the land he'd nearly lost, and she'd won back for him, over the homes full of families who'd once feared him, and now would follow him into any fire, over the whole green, thriving world their love had made out of drought and debt and fear, and neither of them needed to say anything more because it had all been said across a lifetime out loud together, the way they'd promised each other in a stopped wagon in the red light so many years before. The girl who was sold to pay a debt had become the heart of a home and the soul of a valley. The man the whole world had called a monster had become a husband, a father, a neighbor, and the builder of a legacy that would outlast every lie ever told about him. And the fear that had ruled a valley and nearly destroyed them both had been beaten, not with guns or money or vengeance, but by one woman brave enough to look past a monstrous story and demand the truth, and one man brave enough at last to let himself be seen. And that is the truth of it, plain and final. The people the world fears most are so often only the ones who learn to survive its cruelty. In silence, and love does not always arrive gently, but sometimes fights its way to us through fear and lies and the long dark. And when it finally comes, when we are brave enough to let it in, it is stronger than every wall we ever built, and it does not fade, and it does not fail, and it lasts.